Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the NTA's annual winter meeting. In these COVID times, things have really been different. So we're really glad that you can make something similar by being here. My name is Eric Karstensen. I'm the president of the Nebraska Telecommunications Association, and it's my job to get things started off here this morning. First of all, just a quick word about who the NTA is. This is my elevator speech. NTA is a statewide membership organization that represents telecommunications companies throughout the state of Nebraska. Those companies provide broadband and connectivity throughout the state to everybody in cities and to rural areas clear across the state. That's who we are, and our members are with us today. Couple ministerial things that I need to do. First of all, because we're a trade association, the NTA has an antitrust policy. That antitrust policy is available from the NTA office, and this meeting and every meeting of the NTA is conducted in accordance with that policy. The next thing is there's a list of sponsors in your program, and boy, I've got to really sincerely thank them. Their faith in how things are changing with how we have to do things virtually and supporting us by being a sponsor of this meeting is a real investment in the telecom industry going forward. We deeply appreciate your sponsorship. They're available listed in your program and on the NTA website. We've got a really great day of programming. I'm proud of it, and it's going to get us ready to take on 2021 in a really good fashion. Everything from governmental to economic to what's going on in the industry. This is a strong agenda, and so thank you for being here. To get things kicked off is the chairman of the NTA Board of Directors from Northeast Nebraska, Pat McElroy. Pat, take it.
Welcome, everybody. Glad to be here. Thanks for doing the antitrust talk, Eric. In case I skewer anybody, I shouldn't get sued this time. So hard to believe it's already December 2nd. December 2nd is kind of a monumental day in our family. I always remember it because it's my oldest brother's birthday, and being the youngest in the lower half of a large family, it meant a big thing to us because for my oldest brother's birthday, my mom always got him new underwear. So that meant a lot because as it went down, then Jim got new underwear, which meant Terry got Jim's underwear, which meant John got Terry's skivvies, and eventually I got John's skivvies. So if I'm looking a little smug and happy today, you'll know that it's because I got new underwear on. So seriously though, thanks everyone for joining us today. The NTA, our NTA, fulfills a vital role in our state. The unity our organization presents to politicians and administrators is our strength. In this odd year where nothing seems to operate in normal fashion, the NTA has been a proven resource as policymakers try to react and respond to constituents' concerns. We may not always get the policy that we wanted, but through our organization, we are involved in the process and relied upon to offer input in the best interest of all of Nebraska. The NTA isn't just Eric, and it isn't just Amanda, or it isn't just me this year. The NTA is all of us, and the more we are involved, the better it'll be. During my tenure as chairman, I would have loved to continue visiting with all of the members in your place of business. I feel that both Eric and I benefited from open dialogue that everyone shared with us during our visits. But with this thing called COVID going on, we have all been shackled to our own offices. I have enjoyed our conversations during our monthly industry Zoom updates. But I long for everyone to be gathered in the same room. It's just easier for me to read people and to interact. Like right now, I'm staring at 3 or 4 names on a computer screen. It just doesn't seem normal. So in our office, the months of March and April felt as though our management team was writing a new policy every 48 hours. Thankfully, we eventually settled into a new routine and had a very productive year. In the words of the great Scott Frost, we are busy now trying to button up a few loose projects we'd love to have completed in 2020. I'm sure the experience is similar with everyone across the state. At the end of the day, though, I believe that our industry won some newfound respect because of how our staffs and networks performed during the pandemic. Good service turned out to be what the members of this organization became known for. We all listened to our customers' needs and responded with great compassion. They say iron tested by fire is the strongest, and with the surge in customer demand acting as our fire, the performance of our networks we have built ruled the day. I'd like to take just a second to thank Jamanda and Eric for putting this program together. Jamanda truly has a gift for organizing these events. As chairman, I can say these two go out of their way to make my job easy. Also, as chairman, I would like to encourage everyone on this conference call to get involved with the NTA. This experience has given me a far greater understanding of how things operate at many levels across the state. And I believe this experience would benefit anyone in a similar situation that gets involved. Lastly, as you all probably know, this is Eric's last meeting as president of the NTA. Eric is a true professional that has led our organization for over 22 years. During our biweekly calls, I learned a lot about procedural processes that I was completely unaware of. I learned about historical industry knowledge and more than I care to know about how the unicameral operates. I'm kind of not into the politics down in Lincoln. I learned how to always have my ears tuned in to envision how everything might affect one of us on this call. I also learned about Eric's passion for flying and his new passion of voiceover work. Above all, I felt that Eric and I became better friends through the process, the calls, and I will miss that when he is gone. He has earned the right of a great retirement, but his optimism and knowledge will be greatly missed by all of us. Eric, I'm glad I got to share the last 18 months with you, and I wish you nothing but the best in your retirement. So if you could all just give me a round of applause. Thanks for Eric. Thanks for all you do. And I wish him the best. I hope it goes great, and it's kind of neat when someone gets to retire and they're at the top of their game. So good luck to that, Eric. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mary Ritter. Mary was elected to the Nebraska Public Service Commission in November of 2016, representing the 5th district of the state comprised of 47 counties. Commissioner Ritter has a background in communications. She grew up in rural Schuyler on a family farm, and together with her husband, John, owns and operates Ritter Hereford Ranch west of Callaway, Nebraska. She graduated from Creighton University and received an EDGE certificate in entrepreneurism from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Commissioner Ritter and her husband have 4 daughters, a son-in-law, 2 sons, and daughters-in-law and 3 grandchildren. On behalf of the NTA, I would like to thank Commissioner Ritter for spearheading connections-based funding of the NUSF. I don't know about everybody else out there, but seeing the fund be stabilized and not declining every year has been a good thing for us and allows for some predictability when we look at our future budgets and how we're going to spend our money. So thank you, Commissioner Ritter, and thanks for all you do. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. I need to update that
bio.
resume. I now have 5 grandchildren.
Oh boy.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you, NTA, for including me as part of your winter meeting. It's good to gather and work on common challenges, and it's great you're able to meet despite the pandemic. John's and my state breed association, cattle association, annual meeting was postponed indefinitely last month. So you are fortunate your staff can keep you moving forward despite the challenges of meeting this way. I appreciate being here today with you, though separately. It's been an interesting year. I'd venture to say none of us have experienced anything like it. I often think about the incredible disruption in our lives, both professionally and personally, and try to imagine how this fits into our ancestors' experiences of wars, sickness and disease, immigration to our country, and so on. And I'm truly amazed at how we've adapted. One day we're reading about a pandemic in another country. Then we're reading about it in our country. Then our state issues mandates, and suddenly work, school, government, families, our lives are much altered, and for many, forever changed. For those students who graduated this May from high school and went on to start their college careers, everything was altered and still they persevere. although it's incredibly challenging to them. I know several kids in first-year college and professional school, daunting when you consider most of them don't meet fellow students or their instructors, study in the same classrooms, or socialize with anyone really. But enough of COVID. What's the state of telecom today at the PSC and on the Rural Broadband Task Force? Here's my rundown of our recent work. 1, our state's dark fiber statutes changed to streamline broadband build-out. We've yet to see if this will affect build-out. 2, the PSC redid our GIS website, the Nebraska Broadband Mapping Project, to make it easier for users to find what providers offer service at what location. You can also easily access information on approved NUSF projects here as well. 3, NUSF 92, our broadband adoption grant program, was initially released in March as a means to reimburse carriers who would help get broadband service to low-income consumers to assist with distance learning. We budgeted $1 million. It ran from mid-March through the end of May, and we only dispersed $205,000. So we followed that up with an order on November 4th to extend the grant program to cover August through December. We plan to reevaluate the program and any remaining funds again for this spring semester. 4, also in NUSF 92, we've received applications for 20 wireless towers from 2 providers. We're in the evaluation period of these applications and hope to complete an award prior to 2021. NUSF 119, our connections docket is turning into an interesting animal, and we haven't gone to hearing yet. We opened a docket asking whether we should move business services to a per connection surcharge as we've done with residential services. This was always our intent when we moved residential to connections, to next look at business connections, and the timing of this is fortuitous. We're seeing changes in our wireless collections that are concerning us. So where earlier I'd wanted a good reason to change from a percentage basis to a connection basis as to why it would be a better means than what we currently have, now we may have been given that reason. I look forward to a robust hearing. 6, for our price cap carriers in NUSF 99. We also recently approved an order that set in motion a new way for how price cap carriers are allocated and can use their support. We made several changes. We upped the minimum speed requirement to 25.3 and expressed preference for fiber. This preference will be assisted by the fact that carriers must be able to reach every location in the exchange. We assigned a dollar support amount to each exchange based on the price cap's remaining eligible areas after RDOF and after existing projects are taken into account. We put a time frame of 6 months for how long carriers have to tell us where they intend to use their money, and an 18-month time frame on how long they have to complete the project, that down from a 2-year time frame to build out previously. And one of the most progressive forward-looking portions of NUSF 99. If the price cap carriers don't show us their projects for 95% of their allocated support in any given year, any remaining portion will be withheld and utilized in exchanges chosen by the PSC, ultimately going towards a reverse auction. This is significant this coming year since price caps have approximately $40 million in their past year's funding together with this year's amount. 7, the reverse auction. So we approved a set of rules that included provisions for a community-based redirection of support, a potential interim step prior to a reverse auction. The Attorney General's office, which must approve the rules, reviewed and indicated that the community-based section needed to be removed because, as some of you had told us, this wasn't included in LB 994. Our own counsel had told me that we didn't need it in our rules to be able to utilize a community-based option, and I should have listened to everyone in this case. So we approved an updated set of rules and have sent them off again to the AG for approval. 8, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. It's currently underway. There's not much I can update you about this. You probably know as much or more than I. It's difficult to tell who the companies are who have bid due to the names they used to identify themselves in the auction, but I look forward very much to learning which areas will get the broadband they need, deserve, and have been waiting for. I understand that AMG, who bid and won large areas in the last auction, is moving along well with their build out. 9, we approved NUSF 117, the E-rate special construction matching funds program, which can connect libraries and schools with fiber. I know this caused some heartburn among NTA members. Not all of the testimony given us was entirely accurate or told the whole story. I realize there are libraries that could receive service that don't for various reasons. But the important piece of 117 to me is that if there are libraries who want broadband service and cannot afford to pay for the construction cost to obtain it, this is an avenue that matches federal, state, and local library funds to accomplish accessibility for a library's community, which in turn benefits those kids who don't have broadband at home and need a site to do homework, or those adults to job search or take classes. 10, as for the Nebraska Rural Broadband Task Force, we had a tour in Arnold and Sutherland in October to view 2 precision ag projects involving Page Wireless. Both were very interesting. Innovative solutions to ag's need to download and upload chunks of data and connect things. And 11, the task force will be addressing the need to form an agriculture subcommittee. I know the task force has 2 business representatives and 1 specifically ag, but the challenge of building out broadband in rural Nebraska is more than connecting households. So I've asked that this subcommittee be formed, and I look forward to its work. We've been very busy and productive at the PSC in recent months. I don't see it slowing down as we finally get to 2021. Best wishes, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you, Mary. That was great.
Welcome.
Commissioner.
So I don't see anything in Q&A. Do we have any questions?
Yes, are there any questions? For Pat, I see you jumped on. Do you have some questions?
Yeah, I was having trouble typing in the Q&A, Amanda, so I don't know.
Oh,
if that's
okay.
the
Well,
way to
great.
go. Maybe just do it in the chat.
Yes.
Mary, do you know where AMG is building in Nebraska?
Someone knows that. I know they're working in the northeast part of the state is where I think a lot of their progress is.
Okay.
Western Nebraska, I don't know how much they may have done there. I was just told that they're making great progress. Quantify that, I don't know.
Yeah. Then the other thing, I can't say too much about the RDOF auction since we were participants to some degree, but I think it's kind of concerning as the rural state of Nebraska. All the bids basically went down in the areas that I looked at below 30%. So rural America is going to get only 30% of what it had been getting in funding for build out of network. Now, there's promises at least that people will build out, but I don't know that that's going to build out fiber networks, and that's my concern with the RDOF auction when I saw it go that low. You know, if say in the past Nebraska was getting $100 million, now they're only going to get 20 million to build out facilities in Nebraska, and I don't think that's in the best interest of Nebraska. So I'm a little concerned about the reverse auction effect and how that'll play. And I guess I just wanted to express that to you as we sit here and talk about it, think about it. So.
Well, regarding RDOF, I'm with you. That's been, I think, I won't say everybody's concern, but a lot of people's concern from the beginning when they released how they were going to do it, right? Or in the previous auction. And regarding our state legislated required reverse auction, that's why that middle piece I kept saying, after it was suggested to the commission, I really, really liked it. As far as I'm concerned, we're still going to have that middle piece. It may not be in our rules and regs for the reverse auction, but we're going to have that piece in there because the reverse auction is a last ditch effort. I don't know if that's the right way to word it, but it's like if nothing else can possibly ever happen, then that'll serve the need, right? And you don't even know if they'll really actually build it.
Yeah, that's my concern. I think it's going to put more pressure on the NUSF because there's going to be a gap. If in that's where we'll probably turn to the state and say, how can we make this work? So just voicing my thoughts.
Depends who it is that gets that bid, whether they'll come to NUSF for anything. I don't know necessarily they would, given the kind of technology that's likely to be used.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
I am not seeing any.
I'm
But
not either.
what a great conversation. Thank you so much for
You're
being
welcome.
here and for your time. We
Have a
really
good day.
appreciate it.
You're welcome. Have a good day today.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll go ahead and start. I get to do the intro, so I'm very excited about that. We've got Senator Hilgers joining us. Senator Hilgers hails from District 21, which covers Northwest Lancaster County, and he is about to start his second term in the Nebraska legislature. He serves on many committees, including government, military, and veteran affairs, education, and telecommunications. He's the founder of Hilgers Raven, a professional limited liability company. Mike is married to Heather, and together they have, is it 4 or 5 children now? 4 children. Okay, well, I didn't know if something happened over quarantine or anything. Well, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing what you've got to tell us today.
Hey, can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. I had a little trouble dialing in. So, hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to see. It's great to be here today. Wow, I look at the participant list. Quite the crew across Nebraska. So I'm pretty excited to be able to have the opportunity to speak. I love efficiency, and so the ability to speak to so many people at one time, I think, is something I deeply value. So, thanks for the invitation. I thought what I would do today is just talk a little bit about broadband, which I know is a very big topic, and in a lot of ways, I think probably both in the industry, in the legislature, probably also on the PSC, and certainly the public, the sense of broadband and what it means a lot of times feels very amorphous. And we all know what it means in our own individual lives, our industry. You know, what does high-speed internet mean? But expanding broadband, especially outside of our major metropolitan areas, has been a challenge that has felt, at least from my perspective as a policymaker, one that has felt like we don't even know if we're taking 2 steps forward. We feel like we're making some progress, but we have no way to really judge it. In my view, I mean, that's a very high level view as a policymaker. As I think they mentioned, I'm on the Telecommunications Transportation Committee. In the last 4 years, we have certainly made progress, and we've had a number of really good, talented people engaged on trying to expand broadband, and I applaud and appreciate those efforts. But despite the efforts, from my perspective, it certainly feels like that we haven't made the kind of progress that we all want to make. And we all know that broadband expansion in Nebraska is one of the most important things that we could accomplish as both policymakers and industry participants. And I think that was true in February of this year, but it is even more true now, because as we're seeing it with the pandemic and the dislocation and the disruption of normal work habits and patterns around the country, broadband is going to be the tool that will unlock opportunities for greater Nebraska, not just greater Nebraska, frankly, Lincoln and Omaha, to expand, to create small businesses, to recruit families, to keep families, to provide those professional opportunities that maybe weren't available to us in the same way, either without broadband or before the pandemic. And I'll give you one brief example from my own practice, and then I'll segue to sort of where I see the next couple of years going, if that works. And I'm happy to take questions. So my law practice, I started it 9 years ago, and we actually, we talk about this concept of geographic arbitrage, which is this idea of going and doing things in a lower cost location, but competing nationally. And we have built in Lincoln, really, it's a national firm, done something that really is unique around the country, which is build sort of a national quality law firm that does work from coast to coast. And we've done it in Lincoln, and with our lower cost environment, it's made us incredibly competitive. And this is a ground up business that was started here in Lincoln. The reason we were able to do it is because we had really good broadband in Lincoln. And what we have found is that we have been able to compete on the lower cost basis around the country. And we've been able to recruit people, both native Nebraskans who have left and looking for job opportunities at home, and people who are not from Nebraska at all. We've recruited families to Lincoln who are disillusioned with big city living, the commutes, the now with the pandemic, the shutdowns, the what they feel like is sort of difficult living conditions, or at least ones that aren't conducive to the quality of life that this next generation wants to have, where they can see their family more often. And so I have seen it personally, the power and value of having high-speed internet and the ability to compete nationally. And so I've raised that because that is something that can be replicated with the right leadership, but critically with the right infrastructure in communities across the state. And we know that that is happening already, but we need to do it at scale. So as a business owner, and you all, industry participants that are on this call, I know understand this. When I think of developing a plan for anything, I don't typically think of it as, well, I just want to grow something or expand it and just sort of use kind of descriptive, qualitative words. I mean, obviously we have goals that we describe to ourselves, but I think of it, and I think most business owners think of goals and tasks in really an objective kind of quantitative perspective. In other words, I want to have X, my business, X revenue growth in Y years. And I want to hire Z employees in Y years. And those are they're things that we can benchmark and that we can grow against and we can measure ourselves. And I think the numbers, when done right, can really tell an important, powerful story for whoever the stakeholders are in my business. But when it comes to broadband, it potentially tells a really powerful story to the public, to community leaders around the state, to the industry, to the PSC, to businesses that want to relocate, families that want to relocate. There is a gulf of difference, in my view, between saying we want to expand broadband, which we all want to do, and saying we want to expand broadband defined as something that's high speed that we can all get our minds around and understand what that means practically for our families and businesses. And we want to do it in a certain time limited period of time, not expand it generally or generically, but we want to get this accomplished within a certain scope of or a certain goal that we can scope out, and we want to do it within a certain amount of time. And I think if you're a mayor in a community around the state, or if you're a business owner, if you're a potential entrepreneur in a community around the state, you're in Valentine or Holdridge or somewhere else, and you start to see that, you can plan around that. If you think that it is realistic, you will have meaningful, reliable, ubiquitous broadband in your community in 2 years or 1 year or 3 years, you can start to plan. Or if you are thinking about moving back home, if you're one of those communities and you are from one of those communities and you're now living in Illinois or Kansas, and you want to come home and you know that right now that wherever you're from doesn't have reliable broadband, but it might in a year or two, you can start to plan for your own families and might impact your decision. So I think as a policymaker, from my perspective, my goal as I've thought about this over the last year is we've got to come up with, first and foremost, a plan that will actually expand broadband in a meaningful, objectively measured way in as many communities as we possibly can in a time limited way. So in other words, whether it's 2 years, 4 years, 3 years, six years, whatever it is, we need to define that, and then we need to aggressively pursue it. And so over the last 6 or 8 months, in particular, with that goal in mind, I have been working with a number of industry stakeholders, meeting with others, meeting with the chair of transportation, meeting with the municipalities, meeting with others to try to determine what are the obstacles of that goal, what are reasonable, maybe aggressive, but reasonable and achievable goals. In other words, we could say we want all broadband in everywhere in Nebraska in 3 months, and that's not reasonable or achievable. So we have to have something that's reasonable, that's achievable. But that ultimately my goal is to determine, if we can, a reasonable, achievable, and aggressive timeline in which we can expand broadband in communities around the state that don't currently have it. The end, I think, is easier to define, and it's a little bit something that we're working through, because determining what's reasonable and achievable in the broadband context, as you know, depends on a lot of different variables. It's a very complex regulatory environment, as everyone on this call knows. It's a very expensive proposition. It's one that has ever-shifting technological landscape. Reading even just in the last week about some of the expansion of the SpaceX satellites and your white noise technologies and the fixed wireless technologies as an ever-changing technology landscape. And it's a unique regulatory structure in the sense that we have a regulatory regime that was initially put in place to deal with telephone lines, and not necessarily the broadband environment in which we currently live. And so, and not only is there all of the things that I just mentioned, but there are a lot of different stakeholders that have really significant, important interests and points of view. You have the PSC, and I see Commissioner Ritter on this call. You have obviously the industry participants who are a very important part of this. You have the cities and municipalities. You have business leaders. You have families. You have all these different stakeholders that have different points of view. And so the challenge is to define the end first and foremost. What is reasonable and achievable and aggressive? And then the means is the second and probably more difficult challenge. And in that regard, I have a couple principles that guide me. The first principle is, I think as much as humanly possible, this needs to be industry driven. I'm a very firm and big believer in the capitalist system, the free enterprise system. I think that has led to the technological advances that we have today across all number of fields of human endeavor. And I believe very strongly in the industry participants in the companies that are providing these services here in Nebraska today. So first and foremost, it has to come from the ground up, from the industry and the companies that are already serving Nebraskans. They have the motive and opportunity to get this done, and they're the ones who know their communities the best. So that is one of the primary things. We also have to do it in a way that I think understands, respects, does not disrupt or doesn't disrupt in a way that, this will be disruptive probably in some way. So I don't mean to suggest that it's just going to be status quo, but we need to understand and respect the current regulatory regime and the reliance interest that different companies have placed on that regulatory regime. I'm a big believer, and in other contexts, non-telecommunication contexts, I have fought strongly against trying to disrupt regulatory systems where companies have relied on promises from the state, and I'm reluctant to try to reverse those promises in a way that doesn't leave everyone better off. I also believe very deeply in the concept of abundance, and a concept that life, politics, industry, business, families, you name it, are not zero sum. In that, with enough thought, effort, creativity, and willingness to find different solutions from the whole team, and not just one or two people, that you can truly find win-win-win solutions that make everyone better off than they were before. I think a lot of our politics today tends to be narrow partisan turf battles where it is absolutely zero sum. I win, you lose, you win, I lose. And I think this is a perspective that everyone on this call will appreciate and understand, because I know in your own businesses, you're trying to find win-win-wins every day. And that's how you're in business, and that's how you succeed and grow. And if you don't do that, you're eventually will die. And certainly that's how it's been for my business, and how I've tried to approach my time in the legislature. So the last thing I'll say about all of this is maybe it won't be. Don't want to get your hopes up too early, but I do think so I actually have more than one, so I should have not said that too early. So I've got a couple things to say, and then I'll conclude, and happy to take any questions. One is, I do think everyone ought to think about the next 2 years as a true 2-year time horizon. I think traditionally, or maybe historically, I should say, in the legislature, certainly in my time in the 4 years that I've been there seems to be this sort of, there are bills that certainly that get passed, that get introduced year one and get passed year two. There's no doubt about it. But I think oftentimes, and this is human nature and it's natural, I've been guilty of it, we come into each year and we try sort of treat those years individually. I think sometimes we understand there's a 2-year time horizon, but we kind of come in January, see whatever it is that we can do in 4 or 5 months, and then whatever's left, maybe we'll pick up the pieces in August and September, and see what we want to push the next year. And I don't think that's a bad approach at all, and certainly it's one I have an approach that I have used in the past. But I think the next 2 years, I encourage everyone, especially on this call, especially when it comes to broadband, to truly look at it as success or failure will be what is passed by April 22. And I think the advantage of doing that is it takes a little bit of the time pressure away, because I do think when you get into session, there is time, but it's fleeting, and there are a lot of other demands. And if you if you have a short 5-month time horizon, that sounds like a long time, but I know everyone on this call understands it's actually not a lot of time, especially when so many things are flying around during the course of session. But if you take a 2-year time horizon and you take advantage of the time, and you truly are working incrementally and regularly and with an established cadence and rhythm to move the ball forward, to use an overworn cliche, over the course of not just the session, but understanding coming out of the session, you don't lose time and you just continuously move it forward. You have the time that gives, I think, the time and space to work out these issues with all the different stakeholders. And so I think everyone ought to go into next year thinking 2-year time horizon, what can we accomplish by April 22? I think, and not have anyone get lulled to sleep thinking, well, I've got plenty of time, because the reality is that's 16 months, and if we use it wisely starting today, frankly, starting months ago, we'll be successful in April 22. If we wait till January 22, we won't be. The second thing I would say is I think we have an advantage if from a policymaker's perspective of having the Governor's CARES Act grant program be implemented. That I think that had some of the elements of what I'm talking about, not necessarily the means, but it was time limited, there was money, and it was how much can we get done objectively in a short period of time. And in that program being designed the way that it was, it also helped bring out in a short period of time a lot of objections, ideas, pain points, and maybe a lot of places where different industry participants and regulatory bodies were aligned on certain good pieces of that. And I think a wise approach, at least from my perspective, would be to look to use that as a starting point, not an ending point, but a starting point over the next 2.5 years, to try to build something that could be durable and get the job that we need done. So I think that is this was a process that I wasn't undertaking anyway. I think others were undertaking anyway, but I think the CARES Act grant program is an opportunity for us to take advantage of the learnings from that program and build it into whatever it is that we want to accomplish over the next 2 years. And the last thing I would say is my approach is, and I think the people who have worked closely with me over the last couple of years, I know Eric Carstensen and others who are on this call, I hope can attest to is there's no pride in approach here. Certainly there are fundamental principles that I believe will help drive the best result. Again, relying on free market where we, to the extent humanly possible, is a big part of that. But I have no pride in the approach, and I'd encourage everyone on the call, and this is why I would encourage I'm not singling out NTA members. This is what I would say to anybody is if we could, I certainly will model this as best I can, which is to listen, truly have no pride in approach, try to look at every single possible angle. I tell people good ideas is a volume game. I come up with more ideas than I know what to do with, and the reality is 98% of those ideas are probably bad. But if you come up with the ideas and you stress test them with people who are trusted and people who know, those 2% of the ideas that are good are the ones that you're looking for. And I think having that kind of approach of humility and modesty, knowing that a lot of the ideas may not work out, but we have to look at every single conceivable angle to get these goals accomplished, is exactly the right approach. So I don't have the 5-step program that I'm going to unveil in January on this, and it's still uncertain exactly who's going to bring a bill. But I will tell you, I'll be in the middle of this process, and I want to help provide energy and drive to get it done. I think it could be one of the greatest lasting legacies for the state, not just in Lincoln and Omaha, but around the state and our communities. If we can get something meaningful done, it could change the trajectory for communities around the state in a way that I think should drive energy and urgency to everyone on this call. Certainly gives me energy and urgency to act, to our regulatory bodies, to our municipalities, to everyone involved in this. And I think it's something that, if done right, could unite a broad spectrum of individuals and groups. And it is my hope and intent to help be part of that process and help put some energy behind it. So with that, I didn't mean to chat and talk and filibuster too long. So with that, I'll stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions or take the next step that Eric tells me I should take.
Senator, good morning. I really appreciate you being here, and thank you for your time. I've got the what is it called, moderator feature, and not everybody can jump on and see you personally. So let me just encourage everybody to please go ahead and type your questions, and Jamanda will get them to Senator Hilgers. But since I can do this, I figured I'd jump on and just give you one quick question. I've had this question from several members, Senator, and let me just kind of ask you to run this through your political filter and your business filter. You know, a lot of the programs that we do are very long-term programs, and when they're evaluated on a 15, 20-year horizon, they make sense. But where it starts to, and it makes sense then that we oftentimes have a partner through some sort of a subsidy or something like that, then the projects filter out. Unfortunately, with the CARES, probably not so much the CARES, but with some of the federal programs just recently, when our members would look at going into very, very rural areas, even with that support, it still doesn't make sense. However, when they look at it and then they evaluate it, you know, they put infrastructure into the ground, and that property then has more value, and their property taxes go up. And I have had more than one member tell me, Eric, if I could find some way to not have to pay the increased value of that property tax and have it still be treated like it was before I built, the numbers would work. And that's, of course, on a 20-year horizon. Now, from your perspective, you've been in the legislature and you've seen what these battles are like over property tax relief, and how there's an element that sure as heck isn't gonna want to participate in giving business a property tax break. So that's my question. Do you think that something like that, where we would use something like a tax increment financing for these kinds of projects, would be politically and public policy wise doable? With that, I'm gonna shut my camera off again and encourage everybody to keep asking your questions, but I'll still be here and I'll listen to your answer. God, I feel like I just called, Nebraska online or whatever.
Well, Eric, great to see you this morning. It's a great question. I took a note on it, and this is exactly what I was referring to a second ago. The more ideas, especially ground up ideas like this that come from industry and other stakeholders, are exactly the kind of things that I want to know about. And I'll unpack that question in a way that to maybe help show why it's so powerful from my perspective as a policymaker. Policymakers, especially those who are not in the industry, can come up with any kind of design, whiteboarded design that they think is going to work wonderfully. And I think one of the reasons I ran for office in the first place is I thought there were too many policymakers who, with all the good intent in the world, and an appreciation for their interest in being involved in public service, would nevertheless come up with these ideas that didn't really match the reality on the ground. And what you just pointed out is a great question, because it helps inform thinking as the kind of ideas that actually might work. I'm not interested in general, and specifically with broadband, in ideas. I mean, I'm interested in thinking about ideas. I mean, I hope I've conveyed enough now to suggest that I'll think about any idea, not crazy otherwise, and give it serious consideration, because that's how we make really innovative change. But ideas that don't ultimately do anything and actually could make things worse are ideas that we all should run away from. And so, and ideas that don't take into account the economic incentives and the business case and the cost overhead and the infrastructure and when things pencil out and when they don't on a long-term time horizon for the people who actually will be investing to lay the cable and then maintain it over the life of the project and provide the service those are exactly the questions or the information that we need to be considering as policymakers. So Eric, the first thing I would say is thank you for identifying that. And I would love to explore that more offline with whoever may have raised it or others in your organization who might be able to provide more detail on that and what that could look like. To your second question on the politics of it, you're absolutely right that the politics of a number of issues, especially when it comes to taxes, property tax, probably at the very top of the list, are very thorny and difficult. And certainly any approach would have to seriously consider that piece of it. And it would be premature for me to say, without having thought through not just that particular puzzle piece, but how it all fits together, about how that politics would work out. But I will say this. I think an approach that truly accomplishes the goal that Mike Hilgers is articulating now to get the ball moving. I told you, there's no pride in approach here, and there's no pride in goal. What's realistic, achievable, and aggressive? That's what I want to identify. What I start from might not be where we end up at, but I want to get that conversation started. But ultimately, if there's something that is objective and people can get their arms around, and you can articulate the game-changing value, and I think in that regard, this exactly what I'm talking about, the difference between saying, well, we'll expand broadband and we'll raise property taxes, as an example. It's not directly to your question, Eric, what you described, but that's a losing proposition in my view. A winning proposition politically could be something like, oh, by the way, we have a plan that will tackle this problem for 80 communities, 100 communities, or X percentage of the Nebraska's population in the next 4 years. And oh, by the way, wrapped around that plan is an additional set of strategies and tactics, maybe both policy, maybe dollars, maybe just connectivity between leaders amongst the state, whatever it might be. Not everything's legislative or bill related. That is going to take advantage of the infrastructure that we're going to lay in a way that will improve the lives of communities and those in those communities around the state. And the price of doing this transformative change that will change generations and change the trajectory of greater Nebraska for decades is doing this other little thing that might impact property taxes. That is a framing that has a much higher chance of success. Now, the particulars matter, of course. And so that's why I said it's premature to be able to say that. But if you do the work on the front end and you tie it to an objective outcome, that is that itself then a tie to an objective approach to truly actually take advantage of the broadband expansion in a way that will change the communities around the state, I think you put yourself in the best position to be able to get it passed through the legislature. No guarantees, of course, but so thank you for raising that, and that's the kind of idea that I hope other people will raise. I'd love to know about how these different things can impact your own business case for expanding broadband.
I got one in. Commissioner Ritter asked, do you see the Rural Broadband Task Force recommendation of having a statewide broadband coordinator position a right step in expanding broadband in communities around the state? And she asked because the PSC supplements FCC money in rural areas of Nebraska, but the broadband coordination leadership position would work with communities. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I absolutely do, and I really want to applaud the work of the Broadband Task Force. I know a number of the people who worked on that, and they did a tremendous work that we're going to build on. I hope to build on, and I think that the coordinator is one piece of that. I mean, a lot of this is coordination. It's understanding not just the information that we already have, cutting through the different layers, the different silos of information that we have, and be able to coordinate both the infrastructure piece but also understanding how we build on that from an economic development perspective. So I do think that's a really helpful role, and that recommendation was a very good one. I thought all the recommendations of the task force were great, And so this is, my broader point would just be that none of this is meant to detract or disparage certainly any of the work that has been done, both with task force, industry, the CARES Act, the PSC. It's meant to build on that work in a way that's positive and constructive. So no, I think it was very good, and I'm grateful for all the work from all sorts of different folks on this piece.
Great. And then we've got a couple more. Gary Warren in the chat, he said, appreciate your desire to continue to encourage private sector investment in broadband. Is additional funding for broadband in rural areas a realistic goal for the legislature to pursue in the coming session? If so, where do you see the focus? Farms and ranch services, or within city limits or rural communities? And if within city limits, any ideas on how we make sure incumbent providers' current investments are appropriately and fairly handled?
Great question, Gary. I think I owe you an email too. Been a little busy post-election, so I think Gary emailed me yesterday actually. So that's his way of saying, Hilgers, get back to me. No, I think it's an outstanding question. I think we certainly are in a pandemic year, and the budget is going to be a big issue. There's no doubt about it. And I think, but I also think as a business owner myself, and being around a lot of creative, innovative thinkers, that where there is a will, there's a way. And so I think here's how I would approach it, my methodology for approaching it. Put aside the money for now, and instead construct a program that will accomplish what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And a program of the kind that I've described that achieves at least the ends that I've described. I mean, the program itself, I haven't gone into any kind of detail because it's still in flux. But the ends that I'm describing, something that truly is transformative and gets something done objectively, if we can actually find something that's realistic, achievable, and aggressive, we'll be able to put a price around that. And hopefully, if we figure out the structure where if we truly people see it as win-win-win, and we'll have a realistic dollar amount. Now, at that point, then the question is, how do you pay for it? And I think one approach to governing is to say, well, do we have the dollars in the state budget or not? And I know that's not what Gary's asking specifically, but I wouldn't ask that question that way, because there are so many embedded pieces to this. What you could imagine, just a number of questions that could be answered as a threshold to even know what the price tag is. Could you, for instance, do the dollars need to be all grant dollars, or could they be a no interest loan? If so, could this be done through a revolving credit facility just backed by the state? Could there be creative solutions that bring in private capital dollars in ways that are state backed? There are within a low interest rate environment that we're in around the country, capital is looking for places to land with guaranteed returns. Are there creative ways that the state could encourage and foster that without putting many, or actually maybe putting general fund dollars at risk, but not actually putting them into the pool? Are there the Nebraska Investment Council? There are dollars there. They're federal dollars. There is capital out there, and state general fund dollars is one. And by the way, I think if we define and can actually find something that's win-win-win, achievable, and everyone's behind and excited about, which, by the way, doesn't mean that everyone gets everything they want. In fact, it is certainly true that there will be no one, myself included, who will get everything that they think is the right thing. And I think approaching it from that perspective will make it more likely we'll get to where we want to go. But if we can find something that will really drive the result that we want, and people can get around it and get excited about it, and it's in this objective world and not this sort of amorphous, we're just going to expand something world, we'll find the dollars. We'll find the dollar. Now, it might be April 22. I mean, this is why I said it's a 2-year time horizon. So let's build the program first, see what the dollar is.
Figure out how to fund it.
Yeah, now we'll say and I know I'm almost out of time, so let's brief on Gary's second point or question. I certainly think that there's a big difference economically. There's a number of big differences within the town limits and in the rural areas. I mean, certainly the business case is far different. You know, if you're spending $20 million or $10 million to service 20 customers versus 5 towns for that amount and service thousands of customers, obviously there's a different business case. There's a different technologies that will probably come into play, and they needed to be treated. We can't do one and not the other, but we need to be realistic about the best bang for our dollars and the best impacts that we can have. And so we in no way want to leave rural behind, but we also have to understand that it's a different business case. And so we need to take that into account. It's a different dollar amount, different technology. And his question about the incumbent ones are exactly right. This is partly what I was touching on in my initial comments about the regulatory regimes. I mean, we have companies that have invested millions of dollars based on a decades-old regulatory system, and we need to be aware of that. I mean, we're not whiteboarding this thing and starting from scratch, and so we have to treat everyone fairly. If we don't, we're not going to have win-win-wins. What exactly that looks like, we'll find out, and I will tell you, everyone who has had interest in this, from the incumbent carriers to everyone else, has a seat at any table that I'm a part of, and we'll work collaboratively to find ways that will be wins for everybody. And I have not, there's nothing that I've seen, and I'll say this to Gary and everyone else, and I'll shut up. There's nothing that I've seen so far that has told me that there is that these are mutually exclusive goals, being fair to everyone and achieving the end result. Now, we'll find out if we can get there, but I think that's kind of the excitement of the challenge, and some of the fun part is to work together to find how we can achieve it. So.
Agree. Well,
and I'll email you, Gary. I owe you a note. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yes. Just a little change of subject, but from Zolkowski Weber, Jocelyn asks, are there going to be any changes to legislative rules that you expect this next session?
Probably. I'd anticipate some. Historically, there always are some. I would expect, if to the extent that there are some, it would probably fall into three buckets. One will be a bucket that I'm highly interested in, which are rules changes to just make the process better and more fair and better noticed. I've been a practicing litigator for 15 years, and I've seen the ability of solid, strong rules to actually take tension out of the process. People get paid to fight with me, literally. I mean, their clients pay them money to argue with me in my day job. But with good rules and a good approach, a lot of those opponents are friends, and we have really collegial working interactions, and we can go to battle against each other, but still remain close working partners over time. And so a lot of that has to do with the personal approach, but a lot of that has to do with good rules. So I think that's one bucket. I think you may see a bucket of rules changes that help or proposals, whether they pass or not, will greatly depend. That might try to address some of the issues relating to the pandemic and functioning next year. Those may be temporary. And then I think you might see you may see some big proposed changes, and you see big proposed changes every year that I've been there, from changes to the filibuster to open votes for chairs, et cetera. Whether those actually get passed or not, I mean, his past results will probably suggest to everyone that those will have uphill battles, but I would expect some of those to be proposed. I don't have plans to bring those, but I do expect some to be proposed. So.
Great. And then Brian Thompson gave a couple comments real quick about your earlier comments. In your concept, are you considering using general fund dollars for your plan? And it sounds like a numbers game. In your comments, you also sounds like you want providers to be building in town, which you kind of touched on some of that. And then his comment was revolving credit fund is an interesting idea. Matching is really important in this concept, and providers need to have skin in the game, which, I mean, they all know that, and I'm sure you do too.
Yeah, philosophically, the idea of just doing grant dollars is something that I generally am resistant to for the reasons that Brian articulated. I will tell you that I mean it when I say every option should be on the table. Even though I'm ideologically predisposed to resist something like that, I think I would be foolish to not consider it as part of my diligence throughout this process. General fund dollars is on the table. It should be on the table. I think every source of capital that we can pull into should be on the table. Whether they remain on the table when the final puzzle pieces get put together, it's premature to say. If we can find a route that doesn't include general fund dollars, I think it does ease the path. But ultimately, we may need to have some. But I believe that there's a lot of capital in the world, and there's a lot of ways to get that capital deployed without having to put at risk or directly take out of the general fund, at least immediately, dollars. And so I think with some creative minds, I mean, it's amazing. The financial wizards in New York and around the country, it's amazing what they will do. It's amazing what can be done. I'll tell you, and I'm over time and I apologize, but I'll tell you a great example. The Build Finance bill that I brought, LB 616, for those of you who are in Lincoln, or even around the state, you're aware of the South Beltway, is a real life example of what I'm talking about. That is a project that has been talked about for decades, was going to cost several $100 million, still will cost several $100 million, was going to get built in 9 years, was not going to be usable till year 9, till 2029. My little kids were going to be, some of them were going to be close to being in college by then. We had my bill, and I don't take ownership of this, I'm just in a prideful way, but it was my priority bill in 2019 with this build finance concept that took advantage of exactly what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Exactly this creative approach to finding different capital sources is going to get that Beltway done almost 6 years earlier, and save about $30 million. Now, that's not immediately something we could replicate here,
Right.
because it's different. It's apples to oranges. But the point is, that was a creative, innovative approach to a specific problem that did not save general fund dollars. And so I think using that kind of approach here, not necessarily the same mechanism, but using that kind of creative mindset, tapping into the creative capital wizard. That's right. That's a real thing. I think it's cliche sometimes, but it's a real thing. And,
It is.
And toss me all your ideas. And Hilgers at legne.gov. And then let Gary Warren, I'll get back to you right away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Senator Hilgers. We really appreciate you being here with us.
Sorry to go over.
Yeah, that's all right. That's all right. It was a good conversation. We're going to actually take a short break now. So everyone go refill your beverages, use the restroom, check your email, and then we will meet back here at 9:45 for, we've got, I believe, Mike Romano up next. Super excited. All right, we'll see you all really soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Hope you all enjoyed your little break. We're going to go ahead and get started with our next couple of speakers. First up, we've got Mike Romano. Mike joined NTCA as the Senior Vice President of Industry Affairs Business Development on August 23rd, 2010. So you just celebrated 10 years. Congratulations. He currently oversees the organization's public policy, government affairs, business development, and Foundation for Rural Services initiatives on behalf of its nearly 850 small rural telecom provider members, which is fantastic. So I'll kick it over to you. Welcome, Mike.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the chance to at least visit this way. It was great to listen as well to the last presenter and hear everything going on in the state. Hopefully I can complement that a bit by covering some of what's happening at the federal level here relatively quickly. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen. I did put together a short presentation just to kind of help with the discussion and hopefully let you all see sort of some data points too that I'm hoping we can put up here. So hopefully that's come up here and the presentation's up and running. So again, thank you for letting me participate and come in this way. I'll cover what's happening at the federal level, and I'll start with obviously the impacts of COVID. While it hasn't entirely taken over telecom debates here in DC, it certainly has touched every issue, even as unfortunately, as I'll talk about in a little bit, there hasn't been a lot of activity on it. There's been a lot of activity around it, but unfortunately, for better or for worse, there's been some work at the agencies that I'll talk about. In Congress, there's been a lot of talk about it, but action has been a bit short coming in terms of relief packages and the like since the spring. But it's affected everything we've talked about or seen this year. There's a lot of focus on which customers are served or not. The discussion previously about using CARES Act funds to help reach customers. That's been a big focus, and Congress has been a big focus around the country in various states. We're actually hoping to pull together a group of like Eric and others next week to talk a little bit about what states are seeing in this area. But identifying the unserved customers and trying to figure out the maps that are still remain so problematic and get funding for new maps, which is something that folks have been talking about for some time. The FCC has done everything Congress asked of it to get ready to prepare some new and better maps. But Congress now needs to come up with some funding in order for that to actually happen. And that's still very much a work in progress, unfortunately. lot of focus on low-income consumers and how to help them get online, stay online. People are losing jobs, losing hours at restaurants and service industries and the like. And so how do you make sure those people, when they go home or are stuck at home, still have good broadband access? And addressing low-income consumers has become an increasingly important issue. The Lifeline program, in theory, is supposed to help with this, but it's really, we've seen through the COVID crisis that it is not a program that's built for a broadband world. The discounts, the subsidy don't cover what you really needed to make broadband affordable. The hoops that everybody has to jump through, not the least of which are you all as providers, are significant. And so trying to get something better to help low-income consumers get and stay connected has been a big focus of industry, of policymakers. In fact, I think there's a significant consensus around this of trying to rechristen something, perhaps through an appropriated fund, to help low-income consumers. But again, the relief packages just continue to be held up in broader politics at this point. The E-rate program, connecting schools and libraries, it was initially the focus of that program, has gotten a lot of attention as well, because there are stakeholders out there asking that that program be expanded and changed in order to be used for home access. And so there's been a big debate about how that might happen. Are you going to be connecting students who are already connected, giving them a hotspot when they might already have fiber to the house, and it's just the case they're not buying it? NTCA, we had done an initiative working with a group, Education Superhighway, with whom we work well sometimes and not so well in other times. But in this case, we came together, and I know other associations have done so as well, to try to help members connect the dots between local schools and the providers to help identify where there's a student who doesn't necessarily need a new connection or a hotspot, but just needs, again, help paying for a connection at home so that they can learn from home. And then on the infrastructure side, there have been a lot of discussions within sort of COVID stimulus type packages and outside of them as well about, are there ways to deploy networks better? Can we put up networks that are going to be built to last and handle VPNs and remote learning applications and the like? Those have not yet come to pass either, but they continue to be parts of discussions. We know that with changes that we'll talk about in a little bit coming next year, that'll be top of mind for a number of folks in Washington going into the new year. In the meanwhile, we've been sort of forced, if you will, to rely upon the high cost program, the Reconnect program, which has continued to sort of hum along in terms of issuing announcements about new funding opportunities and awards for providers. Those have been relied upon by and large to sort of fill infrastructure gaps at this point in the absence of a broader infrastructure package. So what have we seen in terms of COVID-related activity and policy implications? First thing I think that was relevant this year was the pledge. And so Chairman Pai had announced that he was asking providers to take the pledge. And the pledge had several pieces to it, but basically at the bottom it was, you won't disconnect customers for non-payment if they've had an adverse impact due to COVID. And so that was a significant measure. A lot of people stepped up, a lot of providers stepped up to take that pledge, accept the pledge. And through June 30th, carried forward that agreement. Now that pledge did expire in June, at the end of June. The chairman did ask providers who had taken the pledge to continue to work with customers for payment plans to come current and the like. But the downside of the pledge is that it put many providers in the business of essentially giving service away for free. And in some cases, we've heard from providers that there were customers who previously would be late paying, but then eventually would come on and pay, who now, without the threat of disconnecting, just sort of kept rolling with non-payments over the many months. And so that presented its own challenges. And so what we've seen is that a number of providers, and we just did our most recent survey, on average are seeing about $80,000 in uncollectible amounts from customers who just haven't paid during the pandemic thus far. So the Keeping Critical Connections Act was something that was introduced to really try to address that. And that was a bill that really grew out of a letter that my boss, Shirley Bloomfield, sent to the House and Senate leadership back in mid-March of this year, right when the pandemic first struck, basically saying, hey, we see this train coming down the track. Help us keep these customers connected by providing some sort of fund that people can commit to that says that basically, if you don't disconnect the customer, there'll be a subsidy to pay for that customer's non-paid bill. And help us basically, everybody live up to the pledge, especially smaller providers who can't float that much of the cash flow without that sort of cash flow over time. That bill attracted widespread bipartisan support in both houses of Congress. I think there were 30 to 40 senators and representatives in the House of Representatives who are on that bill now. We continue to try to push, and the sponsors of that bill continue to try to push for inclusion of that sort of a measure in legislation, like a COVID relief package of some kind, a broader package. But thus far, we still haven't seen anything move there. What we have seen, the last really significant bill, that certainly a relief bill that affected telecom at all, was the CARES Act, which I know I've talked about earlier this morning. That was passed back at the end of March. And basically that had a few elements in it that were helpful for smaller providers. The first was the Paycheck Protection Program, which a number of smaller telecom providers, and of course many others across the industry and many industries, availed themselves of, which basically provided some form of forgivable loan in exchange for not downsizing or reducing workforce. An effective program that eventually ran its course, and I know that folks would like to see if maybe it can be included again, renewed again in another relief package. But that was one thing we saw that was relatively effective over the course of 2020. There was also some money in the CARES Act for the FCC to do a telehealth program, which they did, and gave some money, a boost to Reconnect for some additional awards in round 2 that were really things that had been on the table and couldn't be funded in round 1. RUS was given more money to fund those awards. We've seen the agencies step in and take some steps to try to help with COVID relief. We've seen FCC waive some deadlines, and I'll talk a little bit about more that we're talking with them about now still. RUS has done some things to change some reporting requirements, auditing requirements, and the like. DHS and CISO worked very closely with Communication Sector Coordinating Council, which NTCA is a part of, to try to make sure that providers had access letters to reach areas where there were restrictions on, especially crossing state lines, for example. Fuel letters to make sure we're, in cases where there were fuel shortages, providers who were doing essential infrastructure work, critical infrastructure work, could get access to fuel in order to do those jobs. So all of those agencies, I think, stepped up and stepped in very well in terms of working with industry, working with providers, working with consumers to try to make sure that the communications sector continued on with the essential work that it does. Now, what's to come? Again, the few things I mentioned on the last slide, an emergency low-income benefit. The House of Representatives in particular has passed a bill that would basically provide a $50 subsidy for low-income consumers who are affected by the COVID crisis. The hope is that that sort of program would be administratively simpler than the Lifeline program is right now, that hopefully it would take providers out of the middle of trying to figure out who's eligible. And of course, it would provide a much bigger subsidy than the $9.25 that the current Lifeline program provides. So it could be more meaningful. I think there's widespread support for that. And I do think that if there's any COVID relief bill that moves, that sort of a provision is going to be a part of it in all likelihood. That's probably the likeliest telecom-related provision, I think, in any legislation. There also continue to be discussions about maybe expanding E-rate, allowing it again to be used for home access. It's a little harder to see that coming through just because the lines get blurry. How do you tell again whether a house is really unserved or it's just the customer not subscribing to a service that's there? Are people willing to draw those lines? Some of the stakeholders who are behind or supportive of the E-rate expansion, unfortunately, don't always seem to want to play ball when it comes to actually drawing those lines neatly, which I think actually undermines their efforts in a way. But that's another provision that's certainly being discussed. The House of Representatives is also included in legislation they passed on COVID relief, a mandate, essentially a no disconnect mandate, a moratorium on disconnections. It basically takes the pledge, voluntary pledge that the chairman had that expired back in June, reinstitutes it and makes it mandatory. There's a real problem with that, obviously, especially if you don't have something like the Keeping Critical Connections Act to pay for it, because then you're basically in the business of forcing providers to give service away for free for an indefinite period of time. You can only do free for so long before the system breaks. You have employees you've got to pay. You've got suppliers you've got to pay. You've got to buy middle mile bandwidth and capacity. You've got to buy routers and fiber. You can't barter for that, and hope to continue to operate as a business. So, I think we'll see that the Senate, especially if it remains Republican, will be a backstop when it comes to probably heading off some of the more questionable ideas in some of the House legislation that's passed to date. A couple of other ideas that are out there, grants for COVID impacts. So This is kind of like the Keeping Critical Connections Act, but it's a little bit different. It looks a little bit like the Paycheck Protection Program, maybe. But the basic idea here is that USDA there's a big proposal that USDA through RUS would give out basically grants to RUS eligible borrowers, not RUS borrowers, but those companies that are eligible for RUS loans could come in and apply for grants to help with COVID relief. This is just an idea. Again, it's not something that's passing anything yet, but it's a new idea that's popped up in the last couple of months and could be interesting as another means of trying to help with the fact that providers just aren't necessarily in all cases getting paid by their consumers in the ways that they have in the past. What will really end up in here? Hard to say if there's anything that comes forward at all. I do think, again, the low income benefit has probably the best traction. I do think that if there's any disconnection, moratorium, or anything like that, there's a decent chance, especially given the bipartisan support for the Keeping Critical Connections Act, that sort of thing could be attached to it. But those are some of the ideas being floated around right now. The last thing I'll just mention in this is just yesterday, we saw a bipartisan group of senators put forward their own thoughts on COVID relief to try to get something moving. And that did include $10 billion for broadband. Now, the details of that are to be seen. It wouldn't surprise me if there aren't money in the way of details other than maybe something to the effect of the FCC shall distribute $10 billion in unserved areas for broadband. But that's another iron in the fire right now too. So I want to step back for a minute before we go into sort of what the future looks like and what comes next and what we're paying attention to entering 2021. Because I think it's important. We have to sort of learn lessons from how we got to where we are and thinking about where we're going to go next. So it's been a decade since the National Broadband Plan was released. This was the last big sort of vision for what broadband should look like over the next 10 years. And frankly, for small rural carriers, it wasn't a good vision at all. It's funny, as was mentioned in my introduction, I started at NTCA in August of 2010, and I walked in the door, and the first thing I sort of see is this analysis that I've got here on the slide summarized of how bad the National Broadband Plan was going to be for rural carriers, and I sort of thought to myself, well, I guess we've got nowhere to go but up. But the National Broadband Plan laid out a chartered a course that just was not promising for those most committed to serving rural areas. It was going to freeze support, throw everybody onto a mandatory model, ultimately throw everybody into auctions by the next few years then. The analysis that had been done of the plan was that the average RLEC was going to have been cash flow negative by 2015, and 90% of them almost were going to be cash flow negative by 2020 right now. So obviously we had a lot of digging out to do. The good news is we did it. I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from how that went and how we advocated, how the industry advocated leading into the 2010 broadband plan, and some of the mistakes that were made there in terms of pushes and what we can do differently. And even what we've done in the last 5 years or so to really, I think, turn things around. So 2011, there's a transformation order that did better than the National Broadband Plan, but still presented its own challenges and contained a whole bunch of new cuts, caps, and constraints that really didn't, it was hard to see how they connected the dots on advancing broadband. But through that sort of trough, we dug out and ultimately got to the point where in 2018, through sort of recalibrating our advocacy and thinking about building blocks that and steps we could take to position ourselves better, 2018, we got approximately $700 million more a year in increased support for RLEC USF in the form of additional ACAM funding in 2016, more in 2018, more for so-called legacy or CAF BLS recipients as well. So a lot of good things ended up coming through because I think what we really did as an industry is we came together and started talking about the uses of broadband, what people do with broadband in the community, what kinds of broadband we could build. A lot in 2010, 2009, people were focused on, aiming at DSL speeds. The broadband plan itself did that. And it really wasn't forward-looking in that way, which is really funny for something that was hailed as visionary. In 2016, 2017, 2018, and now moving into 2020, we've increasingly positioned ourselves as we're the good guys who are aiming for higher speeds. We're the ones who can deliver it if you give us the chance. And I think that's gone. And then we work with our customers to help them make good use of it. That storyline, I think, has gone a long way and helped us move beyond traditional sort of regulatory advocacy into a storytelling exercise that I think is so valuable. Meanwhile, you've also got Reconnect and auctions that have come online in the last few years. The RDOF auction just wrapped up yesterday. We don't know much about it, so I can't say much about it yet. But we'll be watching that very closely to see whether the results will sort of point us in the right direction, or frankly, auctions are still very much experiments in a way. We'll have to see whether they can deliver on what people think they can versus some more proven mechanisms that are out there, like ACAM, like CAF-BLS. Reconnect, meanwhile, has been a neat shot in the arm in many ways for especially remote areas. In many ways, Reconnect is doing what the Remote Areas Fund, the FCC, talked about in 2010 and 2011 was supposed to do, which is getting broadband into areas that need it most based upon a total lack of even just 10-1 broadband right now. So I think that's been a highly effective program, even if it hasn't been the sort of grand infrastructure program that everybody hoped for. So what are the issues right now? And I really underline right now here to talk about what are we just blocking and tackling on before we get into the sort of what comes next pieces. On ACAM, I think a lot of the discussion is around, are there enough locations in the model to help people meet their build-out obligations? We've had conversations with that about the FCC. Some petitions have been filed recently. We're continuing to talk about that with them. A lot of this is going to be tied up in mapping, broadband mapping, and how the FCC can improve the maps, because that ultimately will help to determine how many locations really do seem to be out there. But there are a number of paths forward. So just be assured that we're continuing to pay close attention to this. We know that folks have build-out obligations coming online, even as soon as next year in the case of ACAM 1. So we're very mindful of that, and it's something we're paying close attention to. On CAF-BLS and HTLS, I think those programs are largely sort of operating as they will, which is a good thing. That's the whole point here, is to get these programs operating in a way that you don't have to think about them. Competitive overlap continues to be a little bit of an issue hanging out there. But again, until maps are done, no one can tell where competitors are really. So I don't see that popping up in the next few years. The budget control is something we continue to watch very closely. As you all will recall, that was a bigger issue a few years ago until 2018 when we got the new infusion of money. In Washington, many times it takes a crisis to fix a problem, and the budget control was something where, in a way, it was a good measure because it helped to show how underfunded the mechanisms were. And we got additional funds as a result of that. But we're watching it now because it has ticked up a little bit, kicked in again. I think right now we feel pretty comfortable that it's not going to jet to high levels, but we are keeping a close eye on it as well. Performance testing is certainly top of mind, and I know some folks, the ACAM 1 folks in particular, I think are going to have some performance testing, pre-testing obligations coming up as soon as January. We are talking to the commission at least weekly about getting ready for that. And in particular, one of the things I think we continue to be concerned about is what are the impacts of COVID on the ability of people to test. So for example, you've got, how much do you want to be entering customers' homes right now on a discretionary basis to install routers or other testing equipment? Do you really want to be doing that in the middle of a pandemic? So last year, the FCC, or this year, I guess earlier this year, gave larger companies a bit more flexibility to how they do that pre-testing. And we are looking for similar flexibility when it comes to smaller companies now, just starting the pre-testing phase. Because while pre-testing is really important, and the whole point of pre-testing was we wanted the chance to basically have an open book test before we had to really test. At the same time, we want to be careful about it. The other issue that's arising in performance testing is we're hearing increasingly concerns about supply chain. Can people get access to the devices they need to test in time to do that? Generally speaking, this may be a COVID-related issue. It may also be a demand-related issue. As all these programs come online, there's potentially increased demand for the supplies needed to fulfill the obligations. So we've been talking to the commission about that as well, and we're trying to figure out what to do. Contributions, it's on the right now slide, but I guess I would say this. We're putting in place a lot of building blocks to have a meaningful conversation about it. This is not something where you can snap your fingers and get it done. I know in Nebraska, you all have done terrific work. You're a leader in terms of nationally and how you've addressed contributions reform within your state fund. Nationally, it's been difficult, in part because it's related to broadband and broadband politics and net neutrality and taxing the internet. We can't just move to a connections approach without tackling the broadband question in some way. So that's made it thornier, but I think there are a lot of good conversations and balls and wheels in motion for that to sort of be addressed. The last thing I'll just say is there's a bill a day. It seems like every day we see more and more in terms of bills coming forward talking about infrastructure and broadband. Real quick, I got some stats here. I won't run through them all, but the point here is that I think through all of this, we've come through and we're an industry that's well positioned for the future. We've got significant fiber to the prem deployment, still more to do, but significant fiber to the prem deployment, higher speeds. The point here on this slide is basically you all are taking the money you're getting and you're putting it into the ground or on poles and investing and getting better broadband to your consumers. And it's a terrific story for us to tell. It's a terrific story for policymakers to hear. Smart Rural Communities helps to share those stories in a way that we can make big branding splashes about them and what have you. The point here is we've done great, you've done great things, and you give us the opportunity to tell great stories. At the same time, we've got more to do. We've got gaps that still need to be filled. And so we've got to focus on those gaps and then sustaining broadband where it is. So what's next? Here's the FCC likely in 2021 at this point. Obviously, with President-elect Biden having been named the winner of the election, subject to any challenges that might be forthcoming, but for now, it looks like he's going to be the president in January. The FCC is likely to consist of the 4 people shown on the slide around him. 2 Democrats on the left side of the slide, the 2 Republicans on the right. There's an asterisk next to the gentleman on the lower right, who is Nathan Symington, who actually, as we speak, is having, or just maybe earlier now, may have wrapped up, basically his nomination go through the Senate Commerce Committee. He is going to replace, if he is put on the commission for sure, confirmed, Mike O'Reilly, whose nomination was withdrawn even as it was moving through the Senate pretty rapidly, to be reseated on the commission for another 5-year term, largely because O'Reilly, I think, ran into a little bit of trouble with the president about some of the social media regulations and things like that. So that'll put the commission at 2-2 if Symington gets on, which interestingly effectively deadlocks the commission for a good part of next year potentially, because they won't be able to move on a lot of things with tie votes. They'll have to move on relatively non-controversial things until that question mark gets filled, which is another Democrat gets added to the commission, which will be interesting if you're going through a Republican Senate. So with Chairman Pai having announced he's going to step down as of the inauguration day, that really puts the pressure on the Republican Senate to get Symington through in order to deadlock the commission so that the Democrats can't move on some of their initiatives. So what are some common threads and distinctions we'll probably see in the coming year? I think when it comes to distribution of universal service dollars, for example, there will be some difference. I don't see the Democrats doing a lot differently in the high cost arena, other than there's still some RDOF work to be done. And again, we won't know exactly what the scope of that is until we see how the auction that's just concluded is publicly announced. But I do think in distribution side, the Democratic FCC will focus more on what more they can do with E-rate, what more they can do with Lifeline, programs that have been, in their view at least, confined largely by Pai's FCC. So I think that's going to be the focus there, more of the Democrats. And again, a deadlocked commission may help preclude the FCC from moving too far on that. In terms of speeds, I think you'll see a Democratic FCC definitely aim for higher speeds. I think you'll see them move towards something where they've been very frustrated with 25.3 as the benchmark. Now, the Republicans kept it there for a variety of reasons related to wanting to get more broadband to everyone before they built higher speeds to some parties. They also kept it there, quite frankly, because it helped with some of their net neutrality arguments about how far broadband was advancing. But I do think, generally speaking, the Democrats will favor higher speeds, and so you'll see a movement towards that throughout the programs. On the budget, I don't foresee the universal service budget changing very much, and because I'll skip down to contributions here on this slide just to make sure we move through everything, because the contribution factor is so high. The contribution factor is probably going to go over 30% in the first quarter of 2021, and if it does so, there's really no room for the universal service budgets to change. So that may actually be an impetus for a Democratic FCC to take on contributions reform in a way we haven't seen before, because if they want to do more with E-rate, they want to do more with Lifeline, I don't know that they really would want to attack the high cost program. I think they voted for and supported it in the past. So I don't think they want to play that zero-sum game. I really don't. So I think they'll instead maybe want to look to contributions reform as something they want to move forward with to help with that. So what does this mean for RLEC USF or USF generally? For the cost-based folks, CAF-BLS folks, the big year right now we're staring at is 2024 when you've got to redo your build-out obligations. I'm hoping that will be a relatively simple exercise. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, Democrats are going to want to see higher speeds. So we're going to want to focus on that and think about how we can put forward build-out proposals that contain higher speeds. On the ACAM side, you've already seen a coalition that includes some of the folks here in the state put forward some really good ideas about moving up the stack, getting higher speeds out to more consumers sooner in advance of 2029 or 2028 when the ACAM expires, and then get an extension for that. I think that's a great roadmap. It's something we're going to be filing support of here very soon. And I think it's something that is consistent with what we've already talked about for in NTCA with ACAM, CAF-BLS, and even the Alaska plan. The only other thing I'll mention on this slide, since I already talked about contributions, are future auctions. You've got price cap areas and mobility fund 5G that I think you're going to continue to see a growth in auctions. Both sides of the aisle like competitive bidding generally, because it allows them to say everybody has the chance to compete for these dollars, these USF dollars, and they think they get more bang for their buck. We'll see if that's actually the case after we see how the RDOF auction's gone. But even if there's some tinkering that needs to be done, some much greater accountability we think that needs to be done in these auctions, I don't think you're going to see competitive bidding go away as a whole. So planning ahead, I guess what I would just say on this slide is that there are a bunch of options of how we can do this. I think we have to be thinking a couple ways in particular. I think the ACAM coalition petition has put forward this idea of an extension, getting more years and no more money per year, but more years of more money in exchange for higher speeds. That seems to be a very prudent and wise path at this point, given budget constraints within the Universal Service Fund. It provides predictability, it provides certainty, it provides policymakers and consumers with higher speeds. It seems like a win-win proposition. And I think that's one you'll see leading the charge in the months and years ahead here. The other one on the slide I think is worth noting is how to win in a multiplayer game. There's going to be more competitive bidding, especially again in the price cap areas, I think. We've got to make sure the rules are designed in a way that makes sure that the best networks really have the best chance to win. You don't want to be redoing auctions every few years because the networks that have been built can't keep pace with demand. We've seen the mistake of that. That's what the broadband plan did. We need to learn from that history and not repeat it. Reconnect, there we've just seen, as I said earlier, a drumbeat of awards, series of appropriations just come through. The appropriators love this program. They love plowing money through this program. There's additional appropriations that have been made in 2020 of $550 million or so, and then you get more proposed for 2021 that we're seeing. This program, I think, is going to continue to move forward. I think RUS will probably put some even more formal structure around it now that it seems to be something that's got its own set of continuity and life cycle to it. The big thing will be what speeds they start to change to, whether they expand the map a little bit by going to 25.1 speeds or not. Robocalling, I just wanted to mention briefly because this is a real issue with with consumer complaints and things and the like. The big issue here for us that we're paying attention to is how this affects smaller providers. Can they implement the robocalling solutions? We're having a lot of discussions. We've gotten some recent extensions and exemptions for smaller and TDM-based providers, which is great. But we're trying to make sure that we continue to look for ways to make sure that everybody ultimately has the same ability, regardless of what kind of customer you are, rural or urban, smaller or larger provider, to participate in robocalling authentication. And so that's something that's going to depend a lot on interconnection between networks. And so that's something we're focused a ton on there. And then finally, I just feel like I need to mention net neutrality. There's nothing specific happening right now, but clearly with a Democratic FCC, you're going to see the pendulum swing back to a net neutrality regulatory regime. The question is, as I mentioned earlier, though, however, is if the FCC is deadlocked to two Democrats and Republicans, will the Democrats really be able to hit the ground running on this? Probably not. And so that's the big reason, frankly. Nathan Symington, if I had to put it bluntly, is being pushed through the Senate as fast as he can so the Democrats cannot carry forward with a net neutrality agenda in early 2021. I mean, that's really what's driving all of this. There are a whole host of key issues that we need to be thinking about in connection with net neutrality as they affect smaller providers. In many ways, this will be a redo of 2015, 2016. Hopefully, we can get some of these issues elevated a little more because in the grand debate over net neutrality last time, I think the smaller providers were not given the credence they needed to because everybody was focused on bigger picture issues. So with that, I'll wrap up here and stop sharing and just come back. And I don't know if there's any time for questions or any questions we want to try to flag.
Yeah, there are two comments. I didn't see any questions come through, but two comments. And a question. Real quick, try to get through these just to move on. content. Thank you so much. It would seem that Brian Thompson from Consolidated, it would seem that pre-testing for small companies should be moved back 6 months until vaccine infrastructure is in place and making testing at home more safe. I don't know if you've got thoughts on that.
Yeah,
But-
I do. Yeah, and so that Brian, that's consistent with what we're talking with the commission about a little bit. I mean, what they did for the price cap companies was they basically pushed back pre-testing, but they said if you've already got devices in place in the customer home, then pre-test, because just use those. And so I think that's kind of where we're going. Like, yeah, if you've got stuff already in place, let's use that, but let's not make people go into homes to put in new devices if you don't have it there.
Yes, makes sense. Eric Carsonson, thanks for being here. Regarding contribution reform, Connections Based is working pretty well in Nebraska for our state high cost fund, which it is.
Yeah, and we've heard that. And as I said, you all are recognized as a leader in terms of thinking about this, and other states have followed in your wake. Our committees, our policy committees have suggested that connections are the best federal approach as well. The problem we run into is if you go beyond voice connections and include broadband connections, we immediately run smack dab into taxing the internet rhetoric from some folks, and that presents the problem. But yeah, I think your roadmap that you all have laid out is a common sense one, and I wish we could do something like that at the federal level.
We'll see.
Yeah.
Is there any discussion in Congress about passing legislation this year extending the time period for states to spend CARES Act money? That came from John Barrett from Great Plains.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Yeah, there are several bills, and one in the House and one in the Senate in particular I'm thinking of, and there may be even others that are talking about just that. They're trying to extend the deadline. They're also, we've talked with Hill folks about it. I know there's an industry letter actually going around right now about it. We may not sign on to that letter because of other things, but that is, yeah, there seems to be a growing consensus that if new relief comes, it should include an extension of that CARES Act money, or clarification that the CARES Act money already works through that period.
Yeah, that would be great. Well, thank you so much for your time. This is so informative. I took a lot of notes.
Great. Yeah, I know I had to rush through things, but thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a great rest of your meeting here.
Yes, thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
And then next up, we've got Justin Brady. Justin is one of NTA's contract lobbyists with Radcliffe, Gilbertson, and Brady, where he's worked in different capacities since 1998. He also serves on our NTA legislative committee, so get to see him often there. So please welcome Justin Brady. Who should be connecting? I hear him. There you are. Welcome, Justin.
Hi, Jamanda. Thank you
Hello.
for the introduction. Hello, everybody. I want to start with just thanking Eric over the years. It's been a pleasure working with Eric. Hate to see him go. I also fully understand moving on. But Eric's done a fantastic job for you all, and as has Jamanda. And they've always provided us with the information we need to help protect or advance your causes. So I do want to thank Eric and Jamanda. So with that, I'm going to start just with a brief recap of last session and then move looking forward to this next session. As you all may recall, last session there was a break in the action, if you will. So they met till they were supposed to meet for 60 days. They made it 43 before they shut down for COVID and came back for 17 and late summer or midsummer, I guess. And during that, I keep referring to it as a special session because that's the way it felt like. They were able to get some major things done. They passed a compromise that moved and passed the new business tax incentive bill. That included in that was a property tax relief bill. It's couched as property tax relief. In reality, it's income tax relief because you get a credit on your income taxes for the property taxes you paid. And they also were able to provide funding for what's called the NEXT project, which is a extremely large medical center hospital that may be built in Omaha in partnership with the federal government and private partners. So, but along those lines, not only on those major pieces, there were some others that passed as well. LB 992 was a bill that we had worked on with Senator Friesen. It dealt with broadband and how do we advance broadband in rural areas or unserved areas. Couple things that I think were significant there. One, it does hopefully opens up the channels to allow more discussion and contracts between public utilities and private telecom companies. And by that, I mean, it hopefully what works is, as we envision, and I do want to thank Gary Warren for his work on this. What we envision is, as these public entities are out there building and need fiber for their use, instead of building their own, they come and have an incentive to contract with you all to say, hey, we'll be your anchor tenant out there 8 miles, 12 miles, 15 miles, 20 miles, whatever, from town, and allows that continuous, ongoing, if you will, expansion into the unserved areas. When I say unserved, the bill defines served areas as 25.3 was served, and if it's unserved, it was below that. So just know, at least when it comes to Nebraska, I know we've used that number 25.3 before because of federal standards, but there is specifically, it talks about served and unserved areas and uses that 25.3. With respect to another bill, LB 996, which was introduced by Senator Brandt. Originally, that bill would have required companies to provide mapping through the PSC and would have added extreme cost to each of your operations to provide that. What this does is it says that the PSC can request or do additional mapping beyond what the feds are doing. They can use crowdsourcing, and no, there's pros and cons to that, but it at least lies and gives the PSC authority if they feel they need it, which was a compromise that we had made to say, if the PSC doesn't have the information they need, we at least ought to give them the authority to go find it. I would have argued that maybe they already had that authority, but at least this satisfied Senator Brandt and others. Moving on to next year, obviously it's going to be different with COVID still, as you all, I'm sure, have changed your operations or had to modify. The legislature is going to modify theirs. Excuse me. And so I want to thank Randy and the legislative committee. We met a few weeks ago and talked about next session and talked about how best to keep your representation in front of senators, but being mindful that times are going to be different. It's no longer going to be standing in the rotunda or hosting events or being at gatherings. And so we worked through and I think came up with a solution that I say in the short term, it could be short or long, but short term will keep your interest in front of senators at the Capitol. And what that plan mainly was is that for now, until you have a new executive director, I or Walt or Corby, but I vision it be me specifically most of the time, will be the point person for the NTA as far as going over and testifying in front of hearings, as far as being the contact with the committee or senators. But I say that not that I'm going to go do it alone. I mean, obviously, if there's an expertise where I need to bring in any member to help out, to testify or talk to senators or set up a Zoom, fully willing and want to do that. So I look at it as they as the senators want to limit contact to the outside world. We are going to have an ongoing contact because of our multiple clients that we represent. And so at this point anyway, they've welcomed some of us into their inner circle, if you will. And so that's at least kind of a tentative plan, knowing that it need to be modified as The legislature modifies their session and how they do it and their rules. And like I said, as a new executive director's on board, and whatever lies in front of us, we'll modify that. Looking specifically at next session, I would say everybody's in agreement that as of today, Mike Hilgers will become the Speaker of the Legislature. I and a couple other lobbyists we have a, not weekly, it's about every 2-week Zoom with Senator Hilgers. We actually have one tonight again, where he reaches out and says, what does the lobby need? And he shares what he and others in the senator side are thinking. We've said to him that one thing we want to do is we need to figure out hearings. We can't have hearing rooms with 300 people in them packed in 250 seats. So we have to figure out how can we still have a legitimate hearing process, but not expose hundreds of people that are always having to be in the Capitol. And so we're still working through that. I can tell you Senator Hilgers' thought as of, anyway, 2 weeks ago was, constitutionally they have to meet. They're going to start on January 6th, and he's going to press the accelerator as fast as he can to try to get through the session. I will be extremely surprised if we meet for all 90 days. There are only 2 things that the senators have to do this year, and that is they have to pass a 2-year budget and they have to redistricting. And I think anything else in Senator Hilgers' mind will take a back seat. He and others are encouraging his colleagues to not introduce any bills. I can tell you I know of 3 senators who have personally told me I am not introducing a single bill. So I think he's trying to really narrow the scope of what they have to actually work on, hope to get through it, and then be done. The one consensus, as best you can, there's always 2 or 3 that would disagree, but the one consensus I think that's there right now among senators is we want to meet starting January 6th, and we want to get done. We do not want to come back in July, August, September, and do what we did this last year. So get done, get out, and even if that's a shorter session, they'll be okay with it. I mentioned, leadership with Senator Hilgers as Speaker. I fully anticipate Senator Friesen to be Chairman of the Transportation Committee. At this point, I only see one change to the Transportation Committee, and that would be Senator Hilgers, by being elected Speaker, he no longer serves on any committees. So that spot would have to be filled. And along those lines, I've kind of given a short list. And if I were to guess today who will fill Senator Hilgers' shoes on the Transportation Committee, it would be Senator Mike Flood from Norfolk. There are a couple others that could do that. Maybe a Mosier or Carol Blood, but I haven't heard that Carol actually wants it. I'm just thinking of people who would have some seniority. The other one that's out there, just for disclosure, is Matt Hansen from Lincoln. He's currently the chair of the Business and Labor Committee. He is going to face a strong fight, and my gut says he probably loses to Ben Hansen. And therefore, I don't know what Matt's going to do. But looking at the makeup, I would bet today that Mike Flood fills that seat. That kind of moves into my next topic of next session as far as bills. When we've had discussion inside the NTA and asked either from an association or members, at least members who are represented on the legislative committee, asked, is anybody bringing a bill next year? And as of a couple of weeks ago when we met, that answer was no. There was nothing we were advocating for to move forward. Now, I know things change. We still have another month till session starts and another 6 weeks till bills have to be introduced. So things change, but as of now, or a couple of weeks ago, we weren't going to advocate the introduction and passage of any bill. I do know that Senator Hilgers and Senator Flood are working on a bill for broadband. Every time they kick around different ideas, no surprise to any of you on the call, it comes back to money. All of a sudden they go, oh yeah, if we had more money, we could do this quicker, or we could expand farther. And the answer is yeah, and that hasn't changed for 50 years or longer. And so I think they're still have that goal of moving somewhere as far as advancing rural broadband. But again, coming back to where do they get the money and how do you distribute it? The same questions we've gone over and over. So they don't have anything concrete yet. Maybe, I know Senator Hilgers was talking to you today. I can't remember if it was before me or after me. Maybe he revealed to you his grand plan, and I'll find out tonight. But at least there's a positive in that people are looking to do it. There's always that uneasiness of how are they going to do it. So we'll just keep in touch with Senator Hilgers. As far as other ideas for next year, I know DED, who distributed the $40 million of grant money for broadband this year. I mean, it really ended up being about 29 point something that they distributed. They, right, wrong, or indifferent, they got a taste of wanting to be in the telecom broadband world. And they've made comments about, hey, maybe we could get some more funding through the appropriations process to also distribute more grants coming next year, not through the Federal CARES Act, but it would be more state funding. Again, can see pros and cons depending on how it's set up. Obviously, don't want to get into a deal where all of a sudden, if you're, I'll make it up. Let's say they get $40 million, another $40 million. Well, you got $40 million going to DED for grants, and you have the PSC distributing their money. Does it make sense to have that work together and have it be closer to 100 or 110 million? Maybe, depending on how the 40 million is distributed through DED. So that's one of those, again, I think we have to wait and see. The devil's in the details. You don't ever want to say no. We're not, I mean, I can't ever envision a time where we'd say, no, we aren't interested in having an additional X million dollars invested in broadband. We just have to wait for the caveat of, but see what's attached to it to get that money. Another idea that I, again, as a conduit, want to share, I don't believe Senator Friesen is actually bringing a bill like this. I had lunch with him about a month ago as we were sitting outside at Billy's having lunch. He said, you know, I was thinking about broadband as I was driving in my tractor, and bonding has worked. They passed a bonding bill for roads funding about a year ago. And he goes, and bonding seems to have worked with the roads. Is there any way we can do that for telecom? And for a quick synopsis of the bonding, really the bonding bill was passed for the South Beltway in Lincoln. And so what it says is that construction company X, in this case, Hawkins Construction, they put up all the money and pay for the whole project themselves. And then the state over the next 7 years will pay them back plus interest. My one comment to Senator Friesen was, I don't know that companies would be opposed to that, except you can't limit it to those large. There aren't going to be many companies if you told them they had to go do a 50 or 100 or $200 million project and front the money. Most companies aren't in that position to be able to do that. I mean, the South Beltway was 200 and some million dollars. So I said, I don't know. I can't sit here and say no to the concept, but I can say you have to extremely limit that back. Of course, again, it came back to, and where do you find the money, Kurt, to pay these companies back? So those are ideas that have been floated out there. I think it's resolved itself as of now, but there was earlier this year an issue. If you remember, we worked really hard and had positions, I think throughout over 2 years, positions on all sides of the 5G and the cell tower siting and bill, and finally ended up in a support position with changes. And it's my understanding there's some issues with a couple cities, or at least third-party vendors, who are still not following that 100%. And so I know from the wireless side, they're working with the vendors, the cities, to try to say, hey, we passed the bill, let's follow it. If not, we've got a new idea. Hopefully they all work together and we don't have to go through another discussion and rounds of how do you do siting and licensing and pull attachments for wireless. The last bill that I know of next year is there's going to be, I believe the cable companies are bringing a bill about pull attachments. So we'll continue to see pull attachments and accelerated timelines for siting. Trying to think of a couple other things for next year. The state chamber created a telecom policy committee, subcommittee. I know a number of you were on the call with Sarah Wellman, who's from Warner Trucking, who's the chairwoman of the Telecom Transportation Committee. She created a subcommittee on broadband. And so I reached out to her. I told her I think it made sense to have companies on her subcommittee, but would be happy to help out in any way I can. I haven't heard back. I mean, I heard back from her, and thanks, Justin, but at least know that that's out there as far as looking at what the state chamber's position, Blueprint's position is.
That would be fantastic.
Yeah.
To get people on that. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to cut you off,
That's
Justin.
fine. That was it.
That was fantastic. And Hilders he was on earlier and he did talk about some of that, but it's funny that you and Friesen had that same conversation that Hilders also talked about with the bond and the South Beltway. Like, maybe those two should be talking, or they have, and they're both talking to everybody else about it.
Yep.
Yes. Well, I don't see any questions, but we really appreciate your time and all you do for the NTA and representing and, being our fighter in the ring.
You bet. You bet.
Yes.
Thank you, Jamanda.
You're welcome. Thanks so much. We're going to take a quick break, about 5 minutes. So everybody refill your drinks, check the email, run to the restroom, and then we will get started at 10:45. Okay. See you shortly. That break went very fast. I don't know how you all feel about it, but it went very fast. So we are back. We have a great speaker for you coming up now. We have Special Agent Saad. He's worked 12 years. He worked 12 years at a software company prior to joining the FBI in 2015. He's assigned to the Omaha Division Cyber Task Force. We probably won't see his face, because if he's in the FBI office, really share that way. But he is here to talk with us today about cybersecurity. So please welcome Special Agent Matthew Saad. Make sure he can get connected. There we go. I can't hear you yet, Matt. Let me see if I can.
How about now?
There you are.
Hey,
Woo-hoo.
it's surprising what that mute button can do.
It's crazy. All
Right,
well,
right.
have at it.
Okay, thank you. No, I just wanted to say thanks to Jamanda and NTA for having us today. We enjoy being in front of all of you, kind of be more proactive. Usually we're on the opposite end of things when, there's actually fraud or a crime committed. So it's always to be upfront and be a little bit more informative on how to avoid things and kind of what we're seeing out there. So thanks again for having us. As Jamanda had mentioned, I have worked for a software company prior to the Bureau. have an accounting degree, and when I first came to Omaha division here, I was working in the Lincoln RA, which is the resident agency. So we're part of Omaha, and the Omaha division covers both Nebraska and Iowa. And so you'll see some of our stats combine both states there. But started working here and worked what they call general criminal. So bank robberies, kidnappings, bank fraud, just general crimes. And then there became a need in the cyber division. So obviously they've seen software in my background and automatically think that I have a computer forensics and security background. So here I am on cyber. I've been on the cyber squad for about 3 years now. It's pretty complex. We have lots of, and you'll see statutes that we go after. We're both on the national security side and the criminal side. And I kind of will jump in there a little bit. So that is how I got started here. But in terms of the FBI and our priorities, most of, if not all of you are familiar with what we do. And obviously being number one, protecting the United States from a terrorist attack, against espionage. And then there you see the third pretty much priority is to protect the United States against cyber-based attacks. Our cyber squad is comprised of task force officers. So we have officers from sheriff's departments and PD that actually assist us with our investigations. Agents, our analysts, we do have computer scientists on staff that will look into malware, deprogram it, and they help us at least kind of even get into the motives of some of these criminals. And then our CART personnel, they're the forensic side of things. So the computer analysis response team, they're the ones that actually will come into a business, image any hard drives or take any forensics that we need there. And as I was saying earlier, we do cyber is kind of oddball here, where we actually investigate both the criminal and national security side of things. Criminal is mostly in what we'll be discussing today, which is business email compromise, ransomware, doxing, and just your basic intrusions. The national security side is obviously nation states trying to, get into government classified systems. Obviously, they're trying to get into our power grids, and even on the terrorist side of things, trying to do or prevent the cyber terrorist attacks on our power grids and so forth. So cyber is involved in pretty much everything, even our bank robberies and the drug organizations use cyber elements in all of their communications. And so cyber is starting to pretty much be involved in every single crime or statute out there. So as we miss this presentation's mostly on going over business email compromise here. So how do most of our cyber attacks begin? Obviously, most of them that we come across are just your straight up phishing scams. A lot of them involve social engineering or both. The phishing scams usually, now that Microsoft Office 365 is gaining speed and pretty much the biggest business email platform out there, that seems to be the highly targeted platform. But what typical scheme is for gaining access to an email account is sending a phishing email that looks like it's coming probably from Microsoft. Recent one, instead of Microsoft Online, it said Microsoft Sort. So just swapped out the R or the F with the R. And so a lot of these people register that domain, gets through spam filters, and then someone actually clicks on that email thinking it is from Microsoft. They will enter their credentials, thinking that it's a reset password or whatever the phishing email has. And then from that point on, the attacker has access to that email account. Now, obviously, we'll talk about things you can do to prevent that, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but it does happen, unfortunately. And obviously, as things change, as companies change their tactics, so do the bad guys. So most of the cyber threats that we deal with, DDoS, doxing, theft of IP, and most basic intrusions. But obviously in the news, the most popular ones are the ones that are pretty much in gaining access, or pretty much the most burdensome are ransomware and business email compromise. And today we're just going to focus on the business email compromise side of things. The reason we do this, you'll see here, IC3 is, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this site, but ic3.gov is where you would go to submit any internet crime. So let's say that you do have a business email compromise. The first thing you want to do if money is sent, you would want to contact your bank. But let's say that your bank caught it in time. This would be the place to go ahead and submit that incident. So ic3.gov actually is part of the FBI's cyber unit, but they will actually take the intake crimes complaints and forward those to the respective law enforcement agency in that state, either victim or subject wise. It also helps us see the schemes that others are doing if there's multiple victims. So it's a really helpful tool for us, and it's an easy way for you guys to submit your complaints. But in terms of the statistics, you'll see that the BEC, they're ever increasing each year. So you'll see that last year, 2019, 1.63 billion, and it's projected to be 2.8 or 08 billion. And obviously these are just complaints that are logged. So a lot of companies out there, for whatever reason, they don't want others to know that there was a compromise. Obviously those are not included in these stats. So these obviously would be increased if all those were logged. So BEC is definitely a hindrance to the U.S. economy. And so that's kind of why we focus on it here in the Omaha division. So what is the actual business email compromise? It usually encompasses a compromise of one's account, either by what we talked about earlier, phishing or social engineering, or just a basic intrusion. A lot of the times it involves both, which is the compromise as well as the spoofing. And if, for those that are not familiar with the spoofing side of things, but it's pretty much making an email look like it came from the person you're talking to. So if you had accounting at IBM.com, you're used to seeing them, the attacker would change at IBM and maybe swap out the I with a 1. So if your spam filter didn't catch it, you're used to dealing with that person, you pretty much will won't see anything past the 1 and think it's or the I, yeah, the 1, and go ahead and accept that email. And you know, you're already talking to them, so you feel like that if they ask to change wire information or bank account information, you're familiar with this person, that you would go ahead and do that. And so that's kind of what these attackers do, is that they just get you to change bank account information. So any wires going out will be directed to their account instead of the account that you thought they were going to. And we'll get in more details on how that works here in a second. The other names you might be familiar with that correlate to the BEC is CEO fraud, man in the email, wire fraud, and the email account compromise. So here's the example of how it works from start to finish for the most part. The business email compromise scams actually involve multiple money hops. And so that's kind of why you see that we have a romance scammer here, because romance scammers actually have their victims be part of the money movement. So in this case, we have Richard, who's AKA Michael. he is talking to Susan over here. So usually they meet on Facebook. They'll talk for a couple months. You know, a lot of times these scammers will search divorce papers or public records, as well as for any obituaries, to find out lonely people out there, unfortunately. And so at that point in time, Michael here starts talking with Susan. Susan will actually invest her time. Pretty much they talk every single day. We've seen these people. I mean, Michael will talk to Susan for at least 6 months before he even asks for money or asks for her to do anything. So obviously he gains her trust. And from there, he knows that if he's ever needed to move money, that he could count on Susan to help him out. So now we have Alex, who's the email fraudster. And most of these guys obviously are in other countries, Nigeria being one of them. And Alex, sitting in Nigeria on his little lawn chair, is kind of coordinating everything. And he then sends his phishing email to Cindy. Cindy enters her credentials. And so now he has access to Cindy's account. At this time, he's going to sit in Cindy's account and just watch to see who she's communicating with. He will set up rules on her account. Any emails that are coming in that have keywords such as wire, payment, ACH, he will then automatically forward that to an outside email account, possibly. We've seen Proton Mail. If you're not familiar with that, it's pretty much, we don't have any logs or anything we can actually help us with the investigation. But a lot of these times, these fraudsters will forward those emails to an outside email account. And we'll get to that too on how you can prevent this or look for ways to find if any accounts have been compromised. But that's the big thing here, is that Alex sets up those rules. He's getting those emails forwarded to him that might have wire information. And so now that Alex has access, he sees that she's talking to Jerry from Acme account. And so he sees that they have a wire coming up. And so what Alex is going to do is he'll send an email on behalf of Cindy saying, hey, our bank account information changed. Go ahead and send the wire to this account, which then is to Susan's account. So obviously he's coordinating with the romance scammer, Michael. And at this time, Michael says, Susan, hey, you're going to be receiving an email, or sorry, a wire with information or with funds, and usually these guys have a made up story that, they have a business and that unfortunately they have to go through another person's account. And Susan accepts that excuse. Obviously she's in love and will do what Michael says. Like I said, the scammers, romance scammers out there, they'll have about 60, I've seen up to about 60 clients. They call them clients. So romance scam victims are their clients. And all they do is sit there and manage each one of them. And they'll talk to them every day, like I said, usually through text message or Google Hangouts. And they just wait for Alex or whatever other email organizations or fraudsters in Nigeria or other countries, Turkey, and kind of direct them on where their funds should go. So now that the wire information went into Susan's account, they will go through another money mule. So Joseph in this case is a money mule, and sometimes these money mules are witting, meaning that they know kind of what they're doing, or unwitting, meaning a lot of these money mules might be college students or people working from home, and these scammers will put on job sites, Craigslist and so forth, saying, hey, do you want to make a quick living? All you have to do is just go into a bank, open up an account, usually with another business's name. These money mules obviously have to give their ID to open up the account. So they really don't know that they're doing anything illegal at that time, or at least some of them don't. Obviously, we can argue that, but what they're told is that all they need to do is accept this wire into their account, and then they could keep, let's say, $1,000, 10% of that, and then they would just get the wire information from whoever to wire the money on to. So obviously, we would see in a typical business BEC case, the money would move through Susan, and then maybe 3 or 4 other money mules until it gets to its final destination. And so the reason for that is pretty much to slow down the investigation. Obviously, we have to go through each bank account, and it just takes time to do that. And so at that point in time, in this case, Susan sends the wire to Joseph. I guess another note on that money mule is a lot of the times we will go talk to these money mules, and depending on their intent, I would just say most of the time they're not prosecuted on their first offense. But obviously it's a case by case basis. And so now at this point in time, Joseph would, if he's the winning money mule, would usually, in the case of Nigeria, instead of they'd take out the cash, instead of wiring it onto an international account, Joseph would actually possibly withdraw it as cash and then purchase commodities such as cars. And that's kind of the big thing in Nigeria, is purchase cars. And then Joseph would then send that on to the scammer, and then originally back to Alex, the email fraudster. And so that's kind of how the chain works. Right now, we are seeing a lot of, even at the romance scammer victims. So if Susan in this case was getting the cash, Richard, or the aka Michael, would direct her to either send it on to Joseph, the money mule, or if he's kind of the end chain, would have her go ahead and put that in a Bitcoin machine, which just ran into one where this lady was actually, that was her pretty much way of getting the money to him, was that she would go to a Bitcoin machine and just load up $50,000, $100,000 in Bitcoins over a couple of days. And then obviously that's in Nigeria. And so we do have ways to work with a Bitcoin company. So, I mean, it's not a dead end for us. Definitely makes things a little bit more difficult, but we are able to get information that hopefully leads us to either Richard or Alex here. So how do we, try to prevent these BECs? Obviously, it depends on each company. If you ever have a bank account information changed, you're dealing with somebody, I know there's companies out there that have just a huge amount of volume of wire transfer, so it's kind of hard to do this kind of phone verifications each time bank account information changes, but that's one way to prevent this. So if you get an email saying bank account information changed, go ahead and pick up the phone and call that person. Probably a lot of companies out there, you guys are using robust email filters already. Obviously, you see those banners now whenever you have an email that originates outside of your company with external messages. So that's one way to see if it's at least outside of your company, to give you an extra warning there. The email platforms such as Office 365, check those defaults. A lot of the times, I know probably about a year ago, Microsoft was not having logging as default. And so if something happened, there would be no logs there, which then would pretty much stop our investigation. So double check, make sure that the logging is enabled. Obviously, Microsoft has a bunch of white papers on how to lock down their side of things. And then also you see the restrict auto forwarding. So you don't want any rules to be set up that would forward emails outside your company. We actually had, with Microsoft, one of our auto forwarding account. So it was a Proton Mail account. We actually were working with Microsoft, and they identified that this one auto forwarding account was actually monitoring 70 different organization platforms out there. So they were just sitting on 70 different customers of Microsoft's waiting for any emails with wire ACHs and so forth to go through. And so that case right there is already up to about $7 million in losses, and that's just what we know about. So with the business email compromise, to give you kind of a comparison, so let's say bank robberies, typical bank robbery will net about $4,000 for the subject of the bank robbery, bank robber. And with your typical business email compromise, a guy sitting in Nigeria, on his lawn chair, will net about $130,000 for your standard business email compromise. So you can see it's a real easy way for them to make a buck, per se. Another thing is to educate employees. I know a lot of companies do the test emails out there, test phishing emails. So obviously that's one way to make your employees familiar with what kind of scams are out there. I do hear those test emails. It's usually the same person that clicks on them. So what if you're a victim? What we mentioned before is ic3.gov. Obviously submit your complaint there. Contact us, your local FBI. So we have one here in Lincoln, Grand Island, North Platte, or even Omaha if you're here in Nebraska. But contact us. We'll work with the banks to try to stop the funds from being taken out. And we are pretty successful at that. Obviously, contact your bank first. Gather all the evidence, headers, wire instructions, and emails. And so the other thing is the financial fraud kill chain. So there are some restrictions. So there has to be a minimum of $50,000 that were transferred. And what this does, that will work with the banking systems, or even if you submit your complaint through ic3.gov, this will go to the FBI Cyber Command, and they work with banks to try to stop that money from being withdrawn from the subject's account. So we are pretty successful with that. That's why it's so important for you to, the faster you find that there is fraud, to report it, to get the banks to stop it. IC3 obviously is part of that. So it is pretty successful. So I think this has been around for about a year, 2 years now, I think. And it has saved lots of companies money. In terms of, the end result, so we are getting successful prosecutions of these guys. Like I said, most of them that we've been tracking are Nigerians. They no longer do those, Nigerian prince email schemes. They've kind of grown into these BECs. And so, as you can see, this is one that we had in 2019 that we caught. And so once we actually prosecute them, the hard part is getting them to come to the U.S. Nigeria right now does not extradite, meaning we can't just have them come to the U.S., have Nigeria arrest them and then have them extradited here. So either we have to be creative in terms of getting them to go to another country. Let's say maybe they won a lottery somewhere, and so they'll travel there to a country that we have extradition policies with. That's one way we can grab these guys. Or a lot of times they do want to come to the U.S. and maybe they get that visa that they've been wanting. And then they come to the U.S. and then we're waiting for them at the airport, which is kind of fun to be a part of that. The other thing is the actual sanctions. So we are we have individuals. We are able to put sanctions on these actors. And so that is another thing that's in our toolbox to limit their their access to these fraudulent schemes there. So we are gaining traction there with those prosecutions. So at least in the last couple of years, we actually had a huge roundup over there in Nigeria and Malaysia, where we did actually arrest and prosecute either here in the US or even had the Nigerian authorities do their prosecution on them. So things are getting better there. In terms of information sharing, a lot of you guys might be part of like our InfraGuard, but we actually send out these private industry notifications, flash messages, kind of educate other companies in terms of what we're seeing out there and how to protect your system. So if you want more information on that, I'll have my email address at the end here, and we can get you on that list, or at least I could tell you kind of how to go about that process. So it looks like, I think 11:15. So if any questions out there in regards to BECs or anything else you guys want to discuss.
Social Agent, I've got a couple that came in. First one, you can hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, great. First one is, how many email scammers have you been able to catch over the last year?
Over the last year, so we pretty much focus on our area here, which is Nebraska and Iowa. Prosecutions, I would say there's been about, I know we had one case that involved about 6 other, and they were all Nigerians, but in total for the last year, I think it's around 10 that were either had a victim. Well, most of the victims would be here in Nebraska. So about 10 actual Nigerians that we've prosecuted. And so we are getting better.
I believe that. Another one came in was, do you have any experience with how the local phone industry or telecommunications industry can help prevent some of the email scams?
That is a good question. I'll have to think more about that. Nothing comes to my head right now.
Okay.
But whoever has asked that question, yeah, please, let's get in contact and we could work through that.
That sounds good. That was Eric Carstensen, the president of the NTA. So,
Okay. All right. Good question.
I mean, we'll definitely stay in contact you, see if there's something else that, if there's anything.
Yeah, that'd be
got
great.
Another one from David Holzel. What have the total amount related to those convictions, those 10 that you mentioned?
In terms of sentencing?
That or maybe recovered, either one.
Recovered, unfortunately, usually the recovery part of things, obviously these guys are not savers, so they'll pretty much
Right.
spend it. I really don't have any firm numbers there in terms of the ones that we've prosecuted, but the typical sentencing wise is about 3 years for these guys. So obviously we're trying to work with Congress to make our statutes a little bit more stricter there in terms of sentencing, but the typical sentencing is about 3 years for these guys.
Yeah, I guess he clarified, how much did they get away with?
How much did they get away with? I think one of the ones with the 6 individuals, I think that was up into the like 10 or 11 million that we actually knew about.
Holy moly.
Yeah.
That makes me super nervous.
Yes, that's why we try to educate as many companies as we can on these schemes, because they are lots of losses involved.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for your time, Social Agent. Really appreciate it. Learned a lot about romance scammers and not just the ones on Bumble. So that was awesome.
Right. Well,
All
thanks for
right.
having us.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. All right. So next up, we've got Will. Will is currently a senior research fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State. Previously, he was the Director of Technology and Innovation Policy at the American Action Forum, and prior to that, the Director of Operations at the International Center for Law and Economics. In his day job, he specializes in the public policy and economics of telecommunication, the internet, platform companies, and AI. His research is focused on expanding human flourishing, reforming government and institutions to make them work for people and learning. Welcome, Will.
Yeah, thanks for having me. All right, let's get this set up. So hold on just 1 second while I share my screen. You know, I love these events because you get no audience feedback until the very, very end, so you don't know if you're losing people, and it's quite lovely. So it kind of sometimes is a little fun and complicated, and you know, I guess we're all kind of muddling through this. Okay, so hopefully everyone should be able to see my screen right now, which I'm assuming.
Yes.
Yeah, cool, perfect. So obviously, you know, thanks everyone for having me here today, and thank you for for spending some time to talk through some of these issues. I guess I'm batting cleanup and all of this, but yeah, my name is Will Reinhardt. I'm a senior research fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. I'm really hoping with this kind of conversation to be a little bit interactive towards the end. I've got about 30 minutes of ranting, and I'm hoping to retain about 15 minutes or so of questioning, but that might change. I might go through these things a little bit too quickly because that is unfortunately just how my colleagues always tell me to slow down, but yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of interesting work to be done in this space, and I'm engaged in it I'm pretty involved in this in doing kind of economic research. And yeah, I'm kind of excited to just kind of go through today. And also, like I said, if you have questions, comments, data that you'd like to share, I mean, I'm always looking for data. Restricted use data is always fun to deal with as well. We're doing some of that stuff right now with the census. So, but anyway, like I said, I'm going to try to hit a couple of major points today. And of course, I kind of have to start with the thing and start with the word that I really don't want to start with, but we're here, right? It's COVID-19 really is this kind of interesting sort of, I don't want to say problem, but it really is this interesting thing that's happened in the last last year, obviously, that is going to continue to affect at least the work that I'm doing. And it's really going to be an interesting kind of, you know, as the Army says, it's going to be kind of an interesting threat vector, in the sense that, you know, obviously COVID has brought issues of next generation infrastructure front and center. And I think that everyone that's on this, you know, on this webinar and been talking through these issues are far more knowledgeable than the lay public. But you do see within these sorts of, you know, public policy conversations, both at the federal level and then also within kind of the economic research, I think that we're going to see something that is it's going to take a little while to kind of unpack what's happened this year for obvious reasons, but very bluntly for broadband research, for deployment issues, it weirdly kind of acts like a natural experiment, right? I mean, the entire point of my talk today, and what I'm really hoping to get and kind of work through, is that there's still a lot of really big gaps in what we do and don't know about broadband and its impact on society and its impact on local communities. We have we're in a very bad state of knowledge. And as I keep on telling, you know, my students who I work with, that that one of the big things that we really do need to know is just what are the limits of our own knowledge, right? And you know, I don't want to use a too wonky of a term, but there is this big problem of what you might call broadband epistemology. We really don't know as much as we think we might know, right? There is a lot of local knowledge. You guys are involved in this. You guys know your local communities better than federal, you know, obviously than better than federal policymakers. But trying to translate what's going on at the local level is incredibly difficult. Trying to collect data is incredibly difficult. As an outside researcher, it's incredibly difficult to do a lot of this research as well for various reasons, which I'm going to get into today. But again, this broadband epistemology thing, I think, is something that really drives a lot of my research. And it really is going to drive the public policy conversations, both at the state level and a couple different states, but also at the federal level. So with that, what I'm going to talk about today are, I'm going to hit a couple different things, but really I want to start off with a bit on the state of the world, because this kind of builds, right? I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are. This question about adoption, and there's obviously going to be a lot of conversation around mapping, obviously, but I want to kind of tie these things together for a researcher's perspective and kind of relay what I've seen so far, where the gaps are, these issues that we continually talk about, but how they really manifest themselves in problems of research and knowledge. And then finally, really this big thing that, you know, that everyone's really talking about, the mapping issues, but also kind of related to economic effects and a little bit of the economic effects literature. But yeah, by way of background, I'm an applied economist. I'm actually, previous to that, I used to teach rhetoric. So I kind of had a circuitous path towards working in large scale data and doing applied economics. But again, if you have any questions, comments, I will have all my information at the very, very end. Please send me anything that you have. And if I got wrong and you don't want to call me out on this webinar, please do it otherwise and send me a note. So let's just kind of get into it. Oops, sorry, having some issues with these. Okay, there we go. So I pulled this. This is where we're at right now. So this is the most recent data from the FCC on fixed deployment. And when I look at this, I actually, I see pretty good data. And I do this about every 6 months or so. I do a data poll whenever new data comes out, and things really have been actually looking pretty good. Unfortunately, this sort of one or more providers, two or more providers, this sort of data tends to be used a lot for competition questions, which I am, just as an economist, I really have actually very, very deep problems with using this sort of data to actually explain the competition and what the market looks like, broadly speaking. But again, these like kind of singular snapshots actually look really, really good. And as you can see here, there tends to be both with urban and rural areas, you do seem to have a lot of broadband deployment at this, and this is at the 25.3 level. This is the determined level for the FCC, and this also, it should very, very important to note, this excludes, typically as these things do, this excludes satellite providers, which could be obviously a big change in the next couple of years, but that's kind of down the road. But regardless, when you look at this kind of static snapshot, it looks pretty good. And then when you do the dynamic look, right, if you look at the dynamic changes over time, that also actually looks really, really good. You see these fixed connections changing pretty dramatically. And again, this is the most recent data that the FCC has put out in easily tabular formats. This obviously changes pretty quickly, and everyone here does Form 477, so they know the problems that exist there, as well as the issues that are trying to get solved. But I'm very actually quite positive when I talk to people about this, and I think you should be as well, as far as the deployment is concerned, and these kind of different levels of development in the last really 10 years. And I think they're very, very positive. And I don't think as much is talked about the positive nature and really just how quickly things have changed in this marketplace. But that, to me, I think is actually something key to understand in order to kind of, again, build up the rest of this talk. I think probably the most important thing, and the thing that, we're all really interested in here is yet again, that there is this really interesting change in these shifts that are happening. When I talk to people who work in this space, I continually try to put up, obviously DSL is still very, very competitive. You're seeing changes with cable modems and fiber. When we're talking about these kind of fixed level connections, which oftentimes, again, are the shorthand for competition, that is, these are really the things that we end up talking about, at least at both the federal and kind of in the academy as well. And again, I think it's a credit to everyone who's working in, who's on this call, who's working at this, that the DSL really is, in ADSL, I still think is a very, very competitive service. And it is still a very interesting service that will continue to be developed obviously in the near future, and something that I don't think is well appreciated, at least again, in federal conversations, but I think is actually a very, very key component of competition writ large. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, and the reason why I'm trying to at least lay out this question about deployment, and is this, I think, a very kind of fundamental problem in the conversation that we have over broadband deployment, which you may experience. And really just step back for a second, as an economist, we're using these things as models, right? We're trying to understand the world through models and modeling of various ways. And one of the key ones is obviously supply and demand. Supply and demand really is this kind of really hugely important model that we end up using consistently. And again, you as practitioners know this much better than the outside researchers like myself, or even policymakers, about the kind of actual real world supply demand sort of scheduling that we try to impute through models and through other means. But ultimately, what we're trying to find is this kind of equilibrium point, right? And we're trying to find and trying to understand supply that exists. And in this case, we're trying to look at broadband that exists at a certain price and quality level that ensures that it matches at a demand. So when we think about this, we're thinking about supply and demand at certain price and quantities, or at certain price and qualities that exist within a market. As you know, consumers have very, very different sorts of preferences. And the reason why I think this is really important, and these sorts of things are really important to understand, is that, as I'm going to go through here very, very, very shortly, I think when we're shifting away, especially in the conversation, away from a pure deployment question, and we're seeing, especially at the federal level, a shift, or at least a slight kind of increase in the question of adoption, which I think is really going to drive the conversation, especially in the coming years. And that, to me, has been one of the things that we haven't dealt enough with, at least in the academy and again at the federal level, which is, what do we know about adoption? In fact, we know very, very little about adoption and which programs work the best. We don't really have a good sense of how the people who aren't adopting, what it would take to actually get them adopted. There's been a lot of the FCC actually did some work a couple of years back in a project that tried to understand this, and they basically gave a number of companies funds to go out and do marketing, and basically most of the companies came back and said, yeah, we couldn't find the people that we thought we were going to be able to find. And that's because adoption itself, I think, adoption is a really, really tough problem. But again, it's one that's really it's getting to become more and more important, at least in the larger conversation. And I would say this very clearly. Obviously, COVID has kind of changed this, right? COVID clearly has changed the sorts of priorities that we're talking about. But there's also a new administration that's going to be coming into office in the beginning of the year. And I think that what we're going to see is probably a shift in that as well. And this actually came across the transom literally 2 days ago. I pulled this morning. And this is from the FCC and in particular Jessica Rosenworcel, who has been suggested, or at least shortlisted, as one potential chairperson for the FCC, for the new FCC. She signaled that she actually wants to change an E-rate and to include home classrooms in this. And so if we're having this sort of conversation around E-rate to include the technology acquisition for classrooms that exist in homes, in individuals, what does that mean for the larger question about adoption, which is really what she's getting at, right? And again, it goes back to the question of COVID, which is that now that we're shifting, or at least potentially are shifting more of our resources towards, or at least want to shift resources towards individuals and families that need assistance. What does that necessarily look like? I've been hopefully, I'm trying to work on some stuff right now to think through what those programs would look like. Obviously, there's a lot going on with E-rate. Obviously, there's a lot that is dealt with through the Universal Service Fund. There's still, again, when you talk about research, Universal Service Fund, from my understanding, I haven't looked at it in about a year, but the Universal Service Fund still has yet to do the kind of broad economic impact analysis that they suggested that they've done. That hasn't been done. So we really don't know how effective some universal service programs are. And I know that's obviously a really key component with everyone here that's on the call. That could change. That there has been some rumblings about potentially shifting around those things. I don't see really universal fund changing all that much, but I do obviously see this interest by the Biden administration to spend something like $20 billion extra dollars, they said, on rural broadband infrastructure. Again, I haven't seen really too much concrete from the upcoming administration, but $80 billion has been floated in some other contexts, in other packages that have been suggested by the Democrats. And so we could see something very, very different, at least in 2021, when it comes to funding for both deployment and then also adoption methods kind of in tandem. Now, what that means practically speaking, I think, and the reason, again, why I keep on at least trying to go, try to hint at this, is that I think that we're probably at this at a very end of this revolution, right? Right now, what we're seeing is, in fact, a lot of people really do have broadband, and we're not seeing the kind of, even though we are seeing kind of changes within the market, we're not seeing the kind of massive growth in the U.S. adults that we saw basically throughout the early 2000s. It's kind of flattened off, and now we're at this range right around, depending on who you talk to, around 80% or so. The reason why that's really important is because that is towards the end of a plateau of what you would consider a technology or an adoption curve, as it's called. So this is a look at really all technology adoption in the U.S. over the time period 1860 to 2019. This is really what we see almost with every single sort of technology. It's an S curve. There's a very specific sort of shape to it. We can model it. Again, that modeling actually hasn't been done in a couple of years, and that's something that I and my team are going to be working on in 2021 to basically figure out, okay, if we just kind of allow the market to stay as it is currently, what's going to happen? What's generally going to happen? How much should we expect to see change within the next, say, 10 years or so? How many new people should we see that are going to adopt these technologies in the next 10 years? And the reason why that's important is that if you do see these kind of slowing technology adoption curves, then what we should expect from the market and the changes that we should expect from the market really should kind of flow from that, right? If there isn't all that much changing as far as new people getting on, but rather people demanding different sort of service, then we're kind of at a different sort of place, which I'm going to kind of hint at here, or at least go through here shortly. The one thing I would actually mention is that, again, I think that we're kind of at the end of at least one sort of revolution, right? We're kind of at the end of the adoption revolution. But again, I'm going to kind of tease this out here shortly. I was kind of surprised when I was looking up actually all of this data that that technology in particular has been pretty quick when it comes to both obviously broadband internet, fixed broadband internet, but also wireless broadband internet. It's been pretty quick adoption through the rest of the world, and it really has been the highlight of the last 10 years. But I was actually surprised, in a small little side note, is that basically almost half of all Americans adopted television in a single 5-year period in the 1950s. So actually the single biggest adoption period, at least technologically speaking, was the television from about 1952 to about the late 1950s. So right in that time period, you saw a massive increase in television consumption, or in television adoption. And again, over time, you basically saw fewer and fewer people not adopting television. And again, I think we're very much in the same sort of way. We haven't completely plateaued, but I think that it's the growth and adoption is just going to be very, very, very different in the next coming years. The reason why, again, I'm going through adoption and into eventually into deployment is that broadband deployment actually, in the Form 477 data, it really doesn't actually do a very good job of describing everything, right? There is actually not very much that broadband deployment actually does to describe economic effects. And that's actually really a very big problem. Now, part of this could be a mapping problem, right? There has been a lot of discussion about trying to do new maps and new changing of maps. But again, going back to this issue of supply and demand, there is this really big and sort of complicated question when you're talking about any given market, and when you're trying to understand what's actually going on and trying to tie some sort of economic effect, like say employment or new companies or new income. When you're trying to do at least those three big kind of economic effects, you really don't see all that much. And when you do actually good work, you don't actually see you don't see that big of an impact from broadband deployment. The single best paper, and I can send this off if there is if there's time later, but the single best paper on this is really this big review in 2017 of basically what's ICT, information communication technology research that we've seen. And it really is pretty interesting when you look at it broadly. But again, I just want to highlight that effectively when you get to broadband deployment, and as far as an academic is concerned, the Form 477 data is very, very easy to, manage and deal with and get access to, but it really doesn't seem to do a very good job of describing the kind of world and describing what people are actually doing at a very kind of fine grained level, which is a problem, right? It's this very, very big problem. We don't have a good sense of, again, since we don't really have a good sense of the way in which people are adopting, and that's, again, everyone here likely has that sort of data, then it becomes a very much more complicated question for academics to try to solve that through other means. And again, this adoption is really, really key. And again, I think we're kind of still at the nascent stages, the early stages of trying to understand, all of that. So yeah, let me hit some of the big areas that we're in. And so the other thing I would mention here, and I've kind of skimmed over, at least kind of lightly talked around this adoption and deployment sort of problem within data. The real thing that, again, the reason why I was bringing up this kind of adoption curves, and the reason I'm talking about the mapping question, and the reason I'm trying to bring all this together, is trying to figure out really which are the best federal policies, and which are the best federal policies, and which are the things that actually really do help individuals. Because, as somebody who is really interested in this kind of core problem, it's that there are limited budgets, right? There's only so much money that a locality can spend on this. And even though states are getting involved in grants and some loans, that to understand how to do the best with limited budgets is, I think, going to be a continual issue. And it's something I'm going to continue to talk about. But broadly speaking, the reason also why this kind of innovation, the deployment and adoption question are so key is that, if you think about this logically, if you have basically what you're looking for as an economist is actually on that curve. So if you're going back just a bit, right? If we're going back and we're looking at these curves, the place that I really have the most and can really understand the world the best is when that curve changes, right? When that curve starts changing its shape, that gives me a lot of information, because I can look at that as that occurs over time, and I can really, really figure out, well, going back to this, right? We have this kind of time period from 2004 to about 2010, 2012, where you see this kind of slope. It's clearly very, very different than after about 2010, where things kind of, they kind of level off. As far as the world is concerned, and as far as being clear about the economic effects of something that's going on, I can be much, much more certain, and I will likely have much better certainty in the 2004 to about the 2010 range than I will from the 2010 range to the 2018 range, just because there's not very much variability when it comes to the change in what's happening. But what this also means then is that if you look at, so this is again adoption, right? If you're looking at people who are adopting this, if you're looking at broadband deployment and you're looking at those numbers, you're just not going to get very useful data as far as describing what's actually going on in people's lives. I shouldn't say what's going on in people's lives, but kind of the pure economic effects. And what you might end up getting are kind of what we know is spurious correlations. They're things that we think we see in the data, but we don't actually see in the data. And again, the once we go towards more adoption, right? Once we get to this place of adoption, then we're also in once we get basically kind of plateaus in adoption, then you're in a slightly different sort of competitive world as well. And you start competing again on speed or potentially on price. And so, going to at least some broadband competition research that I think is really key to understand. And these are three probably papers that I'd really highlight. If you can, again, I can send these off, and I'm more than willing to kind of talk through what these all matter or how these are important. But to me, these are probably the three real key important papers in kind of the broadband competition research space. The first one is from Flam and Veris. Kenneth Flam does really, really great work. The other thing I would say is kind of addendum to my entire talk is that University of Nebraska does some really, really good work. I would highly suggest Gus Hurwitz. He is incredibly intelligent and brilliant. He runs a really good law and econ shop there. And if you have any questions about what's going on, at least the economics locally, he can get you in touch with a lot of local researchers. I was part of one, they had a workshop recently and we were workshopping some papers, and I'm working on some papers that I will preview here shortly, but I highly suggest University of Nebraska and some of the stuff that they're doing. And really with that, I mean, so let me kind of hit through these three major papers. So Flamm and Veris really, I think are really key. This is pretty recent work. And what they actually found, again, is what I'm kind of suggesting here, what I'm really hinting at here, which is that entry and exit by wireline competitors in areas with already existing networks basically has no impact on maximum speeds. And in fact, what you're seeing is actually this weird, complicated thing is happening, that wireless competitors are actually much more important in changing download speeds. What's likely the case is that what's happening is these things are kind of how would you describe them? They're complementary. So as more people demand wireless, then they demand higher speeds for their own broadband, which again suggests that this is actually a lot more demand driven and not necessarily as supply driven, I think, as people would suggest. But his work is very interesting and really suggests, especially that at least in the near future, that competition really is going to be influenced by wireless carriers, not in a direct way, right? Not in a way that necessarily would directly compete, though that could happen, but rather that the demand that's created by wireless carriers basically has this really important effect on wireline carriers. The second real key and important piece of research that I have cite over and over again is a 2011 paper, which really is in kind of a really interesting and important basis of research. This really follows from this really interesting set of papers that came out in the early 1990s from a guy named Bresnahan and Rice. And what Bresnahan and Rice really were trying to figure out is what's the most efficient level, right? What's the most efficient level of markets, or what are the number of competitors that we need in a market to make the most efficient market? And so this really is kind of an interesting problem, but what we see is that, and they use the example of a dentist, right? So in a small town, basically 800 people in a small town could support a dentist, and it doesn't take that far to get here. But the entry of a second dentist doesn't necessarily mean that so if you have 800 people supporting one dentist, that's kind of the threshold level for a dentist, then it doesn't necessarily mean that to get a second dentist that you can only just double that population, that you can get 1,600, residents. In fact, just using basic economic models, you actually would need something like 2,400 residents to get two competitors. And so what the point of this research and the point of Zhao and Orzim is that when you look actually at population, and when you look at the population size for a market, and when you actually do that you do that math, as you are all well aware, that there's this kind of sweet spot of competition between 2 and 3 competitive firms. And that basically if you have more, there really is very little effect on major competitive conduct. Now, this could change in some markets. I'm not saying that all markets are necessarily going to look like this, but broadly speaking, when you do have another entrant, you really don't see a big shift. Instead, what happens is that the investment structure within that area seems to change. And this really gets to this last paper, which is this Landgraf paper, which I think is hugely important. Just was published in September. And Landgraf was looking really at government-owned networks and seeing what happens when government-owned networks come into a market, because it's also this weird sort of natural experiment, right? You have this government-owned network that exists that can come into a market, and basically you can see how a subsidized supplier of broadband comes into a market and changes it. And what he found is that government-owned networks, these GONs, really actually are associated with lower upload and download speeds when private DSL and cable providers, that because you basically have a population size, right? And that population can only maintain really so many competitors within a market. When you have something that is subsidized, that really, I don't want to say it's not natural, but you have basically a GON coming in to very specifically subsidize support, that what ends up happening is that investment ends up towards the investment flows towards the GON and away from the cable and the DSL providers. And in fact, you do have this kind of substitution out. That to me is actually a really important thing that is going to be a big question going into the next year, especially as this conversation over municipal broadband and municipal wireless probably heats up, which I have a feeling is probably going to heat up in the next session. All right, so then let's kind of hit the big and let me take a couple minutes to talk about the thing probably that I know best, which is broadband and economic growth. This is really where a lot of my research in the last couple of years and where into next year is really going to be doing a lot of heavy lifting. These are, I should just say, technically speaking, these are very difficult papers to write. But what we see from at least the macro level perspective is that almost universally there's a positive correlation of broadband deployment with growth. Now, again, as I keep on mentioning, this deployment and adoption thing is a really big problem that we still haven't necessarily dealt with. But for the most part, you see this kind of broad, this broad relationship between the two. The kind of highlight here is that we don't necessarily know the direction, right? We know that there might be this thing that if you put broadband in an industry or broadband in an area, that there will be growth, or that growing firms need broadband or demand broadband as an input. And so overall, just generally speaking, that if you do have subsidies or you do have some sort of entry into that space, that things could change or things could get a little bit wonky, or that this relationship might not necessarily be the same. And you actually do kind of see this, at least in rural regions, right? You see this weird sort of thing that happens. So rural areas that actually had early access to the technology in the 2000s were more likely to have new firms that located there. But it seems to be most pronounced in areas that were near metropolitan areas, basically suggesting that that there is this important agglomeration effect. Now, agglomeration effect just means that there's benefits to living in a city, and that there's economic benefits to living in the city. But we see this a lot. Basically, being close to a population center seems to drive broadband deployment, and that it could be the being connected to an economy which drives both broadband deployment and broadband adoption and economic growth instead of one way to the other. Again, I know I'm kind of skipping around here and kind of making a very complicated space. I'm kind of walking around a very complicated space, but all I'm trying to say is that it is actually very complicated, and everyone here knows that it's complicated, right? That the local impacts are actually can be very, as we say, heterogeneous, right? There are very distinct impacts depending on the region. I will say Nebraska's done a really good job, and you really should tip your hat. Nebraska is in a pretty good position, all things considered. But when you actually do look at local level impacts, we do see that broadband does tend to have kind of a positive impact on sales, right? But actual impact on firm level productivity, we basically see very little effects. So a lot of stuff was done in the mid 2000s, and I know there's going to be kind of a new set of research that will probably come out coming up basically in the next year or so. But effectively, we see this pretty universally that really there is actually very little impact on companies, right? There's firm level productivity. It really doesn't change all that much when a new broadband technology comes in. And in fact, we might actually see this kind of weird reversal at the top. So there's again, thinking about these adoption questions, there's really, there's been two papers that I think are really interesting on this. And there's a third that's in this space as well, that effectively, when you do give super fast broadband, and you see this especially pronounced in rural regions, when you have super fast broadband in a region, that you actually get worse economic outcomes because people then start substituting local retail very quickly for specialized retail, right? So they go away from kind of the mom and pop shops at a local area. And this was kind of one of the big implications and findings from this Douglas and Johan piece. But we also see this occur, and this is the Norden Grenschenstein Gullstrand piece in Norway. We see that in Sweden, that when you give super fast broadband to a region, and rural regions in particular, that basically they start using Amazon and other delivery services in order to get, kind of basic goods. That has the impact of affecting local retail sales. There are very different sorts of impact. And in fact, the only real thing that we do see, I mentioned here this positive impact on sales. The big thing that we actually do see on the positive impact of sales when it comes to broadband deployment, to be very, very clear, is actually farming. So farming almost universally is the strongest. It's the strongest of all of the impacts. And it's the one we really only see. And that kind of makes sense, right? If you have these, you have farmers, my family has been in farming, and the thing that you want is you want an access to a market. So when you actually do have access to kind of international markets through broadband, you can kind of see that, it's easy for you to easily then go in and, potentially sell your wares or figure out a different sort of buyer for your goods. But again, that really was only seen in farming. And again, that really depends a lot. Again, it depends a lot on the kind of farming that you're involved in, which, most stuff is still pretty localized. So the other thing I would mention is, again, kind of related to this weird reversal, there's also a skill polarization problem. And again, that I think is something that is going to probably be dealt with in the upcoming, I wouldn't say upcoming administration, but there will be actually a lot of talk about this. Basically that when you have broadband rollout, and again, a lot of this was looking kind of in that time period that I'd suggested, in that 2004 to about 2010 time period, where we can really see the biggest economic impacts. This Ackerman piece really found that broadband rollouts actually tend to skew skill demand, which again kind of makes sense, right? That it improves labor outcomes and productivity of skilled workers while actually worsening the outcome and productivity of low skilled workers. And again, you see this in other work by Michaels, Natraj, and Renan, that you come in, you've got broadband that comes into a region, and it has the effect of basically polarizing the market itself, or at least polarizing the skill market itself, as some areas change to this new high technology input. Again, this is a lot, and I know I'm going through this pretty quickly, so please, I'm going to end here shortly. But the last thing I want to talk about is what we've got going on. I have really two major projects that I'm working on. One of them is this broadband mapping question, which is endemic. And I am working with Utah and the Utah's broadband project, and we're trying to do some analysis of this to really understand and try to re-estimate what's going on at the federal level. But the big project that we have going on, and the reason why I'm doing the mapping project, is to get better fine-grained data in order to compare this kind of deployment and adoption, because there is still some adoption data that's out there. I want to compare the two and look to see what the impact of state and federal broadband grants have been. And so I've created a database, and we're going to be releasing that probably later next year once we do all of the research and get all the good first cracks at the research. But I've been working with students, and we're collecting literally every single state and federal broadband grant that has gone out to every single state in the United States. And then we're going to do a massive research study next May, June, and look at the impact of these state and federal broadband grants and kind of work through that. That's the two things I've got going on. I'm happy to talk more about kind of academic side of things, where if there's gaps. Obviously, there is a lot that I didn't say and a lot that I didn't go through. I have a lot more research that's on a lot of these areas: rural broadband deployment, what's been going on at the rural level. So with that, I'm just going to end. Again, my name is Will Reinhardt. I'm at the CGO. If you need to contact me, these are the two best ways. Twitter is pretty easy to contact me. I have, unfortunately, Twitter always up, so I'm a very online individual. But either hit me up on Twitter or send me an email, and I'd love to kind of talk through. If I got something wrong, if you've been seeing something that's been happening locally that you think that might be interesting to look at, a project, an adoption program that you've been seeing actually really good effects or a lot of really interesting kind of benefits from, I'm all ears on that. I'm really interested again on this adoption question. So anything and everything that you've got, I would be highly appreciative. And with that, I guess we got a couple minutes now to take questions, but yeah, that's a lot, I know. So
That was great. Well, thank you so much. Lots of information. Hey, nice soda.
Yeah, I have an addiction to Diet Dr. Pepper. It's really a bad problem, but
It's likewise. I've got a couple questions that came
Yeah.
through. Let's see. This is from our president, NTA, Eric
Yeah.
Carstensen. If wireless drives demand, what are your thoughts about the impact of 5G on broadband adoption?
Yeah, so I think this is going to be interesting, right? Because I think that there's probably going to be two interesting effects here. So one effect is you're going to have, you'll have this kind of natural, interesting implication as far as a competitive effect for the fixed side, right? So once 5G 5G speeds are pretty quick. I mean, we are seeing kind of, I don't want to say things have continued obviously at a pretty quick pace. We're seeing a lot of deployment and a lot that's been happening. I didn't go into the story about WISPs. WISPs have really changed in the last couple of years, and they've really come into the market in a pretty I think, an important way. So the way that I see 5G, I think it's really going to have two really important effects. One is that it will at least in some ways provide a competitor to fixed sources, but not I think that's going to be very, very muted. So it'll be in very specific sorts of, I have a feeling probably in very specific rural regions that have very specific kind of infrastructure needs. There's areas, again, I'm actually from Southern Illinois. And so I see, at least in Southern Illinois, there is probably this weird sort of competitive pressure that's probably going to occur, right? So that kind of direct competition, the kind of, as we say, substitutes, right? There might be some substitution effect that goes on. But I think that also, just as important, there's going to be a complementary effect. And this is something that is actually kind of hard to get at in the research, which is that once consumers see that, hey, my 5G is super fast, what about my fixed service? And so you'll see basically consumers demanding, or at least choosing, higher levels of service for their fixed service because their wireless service is quicker, right? And so this is actually a weird sort of effect. So you might see kind of minimal changes as far as this kind of substitution effect occurs. But this idea that demand is basically, demand for wireless is actually pushing back on wired, I think is actually the really interesting key work from Flam and Veras that in fact what you're going to see is a little bit more of that occur in the future, and probably is going to be a really, really big part of understanding what these markets actually look like on the local level. So I don't know if that's a very good descriptor, but to me there's this like, these are two things that are happening kind of simultaneously, right? You have this substitution effect and then also this complementary effect. And those two things, I think it's probably the complementary effect that'll be a little bit more powerful going forward, though the substitution could occur probably in, I don't know, maybe the next five years or so. And again, it really depends on the market and depends on what the local deployment it looks like too. So
Of course. The last question that I have is, will we get a copy of Will's slides?
yes.
And there's links. We've got some people who are interested in those white papers that you referenced, many of those.
Yes, majority of these are academic papers. If you have problems, please send them if you have questions about how to interpret the data, please send them my way.
Okay, great.
Some are better than the others. I will be very, very honest. Probably in the last 5 years, we've done a really good job. And we're getting better with methods, but there's only a handful of people that are in the broadband deployment academic space that are in like the applied area. I don't want to say I know the majority of them, but I do know the majority of them. There's about 6 of us. We talk pretty consistently, and like I have, I've got work that I'm supposed to, after this call is done, I've got a paper that I have to review from from a colleague. So, I mean, it's a pretty small community. There's only a handful of us that are really doing this work anyway. But there is really good work that it will be coming out really that should be coming out this year, next year, 2021. And then towards the end of, yeah. Well, I'm already thinking for next year, right? Like all my strategy docs, everything is already 2021. Yeah. So there will be a lot of really interesting work. And of course, please do send me if you've got comments and things that you think that I went too quickly over, didn't understand, or didn't describe particularly well. Please do send them my way. Those are always helpful. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it today, Will. Great job. And hopefully everyone will be emails after this with all the comments. Awesome. Okay, well, we're gonna end with Eric. Eric's gonna come on and do some closing thoughts and remarks for the day. Eric. There you are. Oh, now he's hidden. And he's back. This is fun. Keep going, keep going.
All right. Well, thank you very much to all of our speakers. I just wanted to summarize real quickly. What a good agenda. My goodness, this was very content rich. And to each of the NTA members, you took time out of your day. I hope you set this up in a conference room and a lot of people were able to enjoy it, but thank you very much for your participation. Also, the planning committee is listed on your agenda and they did a lot of work. They worked with Jamanda and me and really helped put together this high level of content. So thank you very much to each member there. As I mentioned at our beginning, the sponsors had faith in us and they gave us a chance to put this meeting together with this really impressive content. So thank you very much to our sponsors for having faith in us. They are also listed on your program and on our website. And with that, our conference today has ended, as all things must, and so has my time at the NTA. I'll retire at the end of this year. Thank you to Pat for your very kind comments in the opening. I've just loved working for you and for the NTA. Today's event will probably be my last meeting, but I look back to all of them that I've been a part of since 1978. Holy cow, is that a whole bunch of meetings. While I was cleaning out files, I found my first speech that I gave to the NTA in 1998. And back then it was interesting. I was trying to introduce myself to you. And I told you that I have a 4-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter. Today, it's 26 and 29. So like that, you can mark the time that I've been here. I've seen your families grow up and evolve, and I've seen your companies. And it has just been a joy in my life to be part of that. I think trade associations and associations in general are an American invention. Maybe it goes back to when we worked together to raise a barn, and people that did that together found that it really raised them too by helping somebody else. So for me, as I look back at this career in trade association, but especially with the NTA, it's not what I've accomplished, but it's what we've accomplished when we've worked together. By being a strong trade association and working together, we're able to advance the entire industry. At this point in my career, I look back at that and I'm proud. So thank you over the years for supporting me and for supporting the NTA. I'll stand behind what was in that speech in 1998. There's no limit to what we can accomplish for the telecommunications industry when we work together. Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day.